The sharp scent of isopropyl alcohol and cherry-flavored pediatric syrup hung heavy in the stifling air of the small clinic room. Outside, a brutal New England winter was mercilessly whipping freezing rain against the frosted glass of the clinic windows. But inside, the temperature was a suffocating 80 degrees. The heating system at the Boston General Pediatric Clinic was as broken as the neighborhood it served, trapping the stale heat and the mounting tension in equal measure. I pressed 2 fingers against the tiny, fragile wrist of a 4-year-old boy, tuning out the wailing of infants down the hall. I closed my eyes, counting the rapid, fluttering beats of his heart against the pads of my fingers. The clock on the pale yellow wall ticked with agonizing slowness. It read 3:14 p.m. We were 7 hours into a 12-hour shift, and the physical toll on my body was becoming impossible to ignore. My lower back felt as if it were being compressed in a slow-turning vise, the vertebrae grinding together with every heavy step I took across the scuffed linoleum. The boy's mother sat nervously on the edge of the cracked vinyl chair, clutching her worn purse to her chest like a shield. I offered her a reassuring smile, adjusting the cold tubing of my silver stethoscope around my neck. The stethoscope was a graduation gift to myself, purchased after 3 years of grueling night classes and instant noodles. It was my badge of honor, an anchor of my independence, and tangible proof that I, Teresa Sterling, could survive the world on my own terms. "His temperature is coming down," I murmured softly, my voice projecting a calm authority I absolutely did not feel internally. I documented the 102 degrees on his medical chart with precise, practiced handwriting. "The fever reducer is finally doing its job. I've listened to his lungs and they sound clear. No crackles, no wheezing, which means we aren't dealing with pneumonia today. Make sure he stays hydrated. Popsicles work wonders if he absolutely refuses to drink water." The exhausted mother let out a shuddering breath, gathering her son into her arms and pressing a desperate kiss to his damp forehead. She expressed her endless gratitude in rapid, tearful Spanish. I nodded, walking her to the heavy wooden door and offering a gentle squeeze to her tense shoulder. Once the latch clicked shut behind her, the absolute facade of endless energy I had maintained for the past 7 hours instantly shattered. I turned toward the stainless steel sink, twisting the rusted faucet until cold water blasted out in an uneven spray. The moment the icy water hit my skin, I leaned heavily against the cold porcelain edge, bowing my head as a sharp, agonizing ache radiated down my spine. My feet, swollen and screaming inside my cheap white clinical sneakers, throbbed in a steady, dull rhythm. Every joint in my body ached with a profound, terrifying fatigue that I could not afford to acknowledge. I rested my wet, trembling hand instinctively against my abdomen, beneath the stiff, navy blue fabric of my medical scrubs, deliberately purchased 3 sizes too large to swallow my rapidly changing silhouette. My 6-month-old secret shifted. A tiny, fluttery kick pressed against my palm, a silent reminder of the impossible reality I was carrying all alone in the dark. Single motherhood was a relentless tide, and I was drowning one unwashed dish, one double shift, one hidden secret at a time. The physical and emotional exhaustion was a suffocating blanket settling back onto my shoulders, heavy and unforgiving. I didn't have the luxury of collapsing. I had an overpriced heating bill to pay. I had prenatal vitamins to buy entirely out of pocket because my clinic insurance was a bureaucratic nightmare. I had an entire life to build from the ashes of a single impulsive night. The clinic door swung open without a single warning knock. Carl Miller stood in the threshold. The buzzing, harsh fluorescent clinic light above him flickered erratically, making my swollen eyes ache and reinforcing the bone-deep fatigue I was desperately trying to hide. His cheap, overpowering cologne cut through the sterile air like a chemical spill. Our clinic manager was a weak man who measured human suffering purely by profit margins and delayed insurance payouts. His thinning hair was slicked back with too much gel, and his dark tie was always slightly askew, matching the crooked, desperate nature of his opportunistic ambitions. "Teresa," Miller snapped, his watery eyes narrowing as he tapped a cheap plastic pen aggressively against his clipboard. "You just spent 25 minutes in here with a low-income Medicaid case. The standard protocol is 15 minutes max. We are running a high-volume medical facility, not a charity daycare center." I grabbed a rough paper towel, drying my hands with slow, deliberate motions to keep my temper tightly in check. The child's fever was borderline critical when he was brought in. He required a thorough respiratory assessment, and a monitored dosage of antipyretics before I could safely clear him for discharge. The standard medical protocol also dictates that we do not send home toddlers who might suffer a febrile seizure in the waiting room, just to save 10 minutes of company time. Miller's jaw tightened, an ugly shade of mottled red creeping up his neck. He despised being corrected, especially by the female nursing staff he viewed as easily manipulated manual labor. He stepped deeper into the small room, aggressively invading my personal space. I instinctively crossed my arms over my chest, hunching my shoulders forward to pull the baggy, tent-like fabric of my scrubs further away from my protruding stomach. Cover-up makeup and baggy clothing had become my absolute specialty over the past 6 months. I layered foundation 3 shades darker, under my eyes to hide the purple shadows of insomnia. I wore rigid compression undershirts to flatten my silhouette for as long as humanly possible. But at 6 months, the physical evidence of my choices was becoming incredibly difficult to conceal. I lived in constant, hyper-vigilant terror that someone would notice the shift in my posture. Miller was always looking for a weakness to exploit, a vulnerability he could leverage to force me into taking more unpaid overtime or cutting corners on patient care. "Your attitude is becoming a serious liability, Sterling," he sneered, his gaze dropping momentarily to my waist before snapping back up to my face. He didn't see the pregnancy yet. He only saw defiance. "You act like you own this clinic. Just because you know how to read a respiratory chart, you're entirely replaceable. I have a stack of 10 fresh nursing graduates on my desk who would gladly take your night shifts. Maintain your turnaround times. Stop coddling the charity cases, or you'll find yourself out on the freezing street. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" "Crystal," I said quietly, holding his furious gaze with a dead, unblinking stare until he scoffed, turned on his heel, and marched heavily down the linoleum hallway. Once the sound of his footsteps faded into the background noise of the clinic, I let out a shaky, jagged breath, pressing my spine flat against the wall. The clinic was my only source of income. It was a grueling, underpaid nightmare, but it was my only way to secure the mounting hospital delivery fees. I reached into the deep right pocket of my scrubs, my fingers brushing past alcohol prep pads and plastic syringe caps until they touched a heavy, solid, rectangular object. It wasn't a medical tool, it was a Ravellini card, a heavy black card with Alexander's personal number, Davy stamped in gold. The sharp edges were worn down from months of my anxious fingertips, tracing the raised numbers in moments of sheer, isolated panic. It belonged to Alexander Ravellini, the man who owned the shipping ports, the underground ledgers, and the absolute darkest shadows of Boston, the man whose child was currently pressing against my ribs. I hadn't called him. I couldn't. I had perfected the art of being invisible. I hid my body and my secret, because I knew the terrifying magnitude of what would happen if the sovereign of the Ravellini syndicate discovered I was carrying his heir. I chose the grueling, exhausted safety of the pediatric clinic over the gilded, violent cage of his world. My thumb rubbed over the Davy stamped gold lettering. The metal edge was cold, biting sharply into my calloused skin. Right then, a sudden blast of icy air rattled through the clinic's ancient faulty ceiling vent above me. It smelled faintly of ozone and freezing rain, stinging my lungs. That single tactile shock of cold was all it took. The sterile, fluorescent present violently tore away. I was suddenly standing in the suffocating memory of a stormy night 6 months ago. I stared at the guard dog's dark blood spreading across my white uniform, like blood seeping through gauze. It had been late October, unseasonably cold, and the relentless rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets. I had just finished a brutal double shift, walking toward the subway station with my head down, when I heard it. A low, agonizing whine echoing from the narrow, trash-filled alleyway directly behind the clinic. Most people would have kept walking. In this particular part of Boston, stepping into a pitch-dark alley was a guaranteed invitation to a violent tragedy. But my triage nursing instincts overrode my common sense. I clicked on my phone flashlight and stepped bravely into the shadows, the cold rain instantly soaking through my thin jacket. Lying next to a rusted dumpster was a massive cane corso. The dog was a creature of pure muscle and intimidation, but right now, it was trembling, bleeding profusely from a jagged, 6-inch laceration across its flank. It had been slashed, likely in a brutal, territorial altercation. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I dropped to my knees in the filthy puddles, tearing open my canvas medical bag. The rain hammered the city around us, but my focus narrowed entirely to the torn flesh and the fading pulse of the animal. I pulled out my emergency suture kit, a bottle of strong antiseptic, and rolls of sterile gauze. Easy, big guy. I've got you, I whispered, my voice incredibly steady as I applied direct pressure to the wound, completely ignoring how the dark blood soaked through the knees of my pristine white scrubs. I worked methodically, finding deep comfort in the familiar, mechanical motions of trauma triage. Clean the wound, clamp the bleeder, suture the torn muscle. The needle pierced the tough skin, pulling the jagged edges together under my practiced hands. I was tying off the final, meticulous stitch when the atmosphere in the alley suddenly plummeted. The air grew impossibly heavy, tasting of stale rain, expensive tobacco, and impending ruin. Alexander. He was towering, his broad shoulders cutting a terrifying silhouette against the distant, flickering streetlights. He wore a bespoke charcoal wool coat that looked entirely impervious to the heavy rain. His face was a masterpiece of stoic, beautiful cruelty. His jaw clenched so tight I could vividly see the muscle ticking near his ear. His storm gray eyes flicked from his bleeding guard dog down to my blood-soaked hands. In his right hand, loosely gripped but ready to raise, was a matte black suppressed handgun. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply watched the massive dog lick my wrist in quiet gratitude, then holstered his weapon with a smooth, deadly motion. You saved my dog. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated straight through my chest, warm and absolutely terrifying all at once. He was bleeding out, I managed to say, my own voice shaking slightly as the medical adrenaline receded, leaving me freezing and painfully aware of how dangerously out of my depth I was. He stepped forward, closing the heavy distance between us. He didn't offer me money. Instead, he reached down, his large scarred hand wrapping gently around my shivering bicep, and pulled me effortlessly to my feet. The sheer, overwhelming strength radiating from his grip was intoxicating. Your clothes are ruined. You're freezing. My car is waiting. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute command. I was too exhausted, too cold, and entirely too mesmerized to fight him. I allowed him to guide me out of the bloody alley and into the warm back of a waiting armored SUV. That night, I was pulled out of my miserable, struggling existence and thrust directly into the immaculate, terrifying luxury of his Beacon Hill penthouse sanctuary. The contrast was dizzying. While my apartment was a cramped, drafty box with a constantly leaking ceiling, his world was an expansive fortress of dark mahogany, imported black granite countertops, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Boston skyline. I stood shivering in the center of his massive living room, dripping rainwater and dog blood onto his priceless Persian rug. He didn't care about the rug. He disappeared down a long hallway and returned with a thick, heated towel, draping it heavily over my trembling shoulders. The tactile sensation of the warm fabric against my freezing skin was almost too much to bear. There is a guest bathroom down the hall. Go wash the blood off, he instructed quietly, his eyes darkening to the color of aged whiskey as they traced the exhausted lines of my face. Leave your ruined clothes by the door. I will have something brought up for you. When I emerged from the scalding hot shower 20 minutes later, my dirty scrubs were entirely gone. In their place, resting on the cold vanity, was a garment. I should have known something was wrong when I saw what he had provided. Not a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, but a dark burgundy dress. It was exquisite, the heavy silk fabric slipping through my fingers like water. It was a dress designed to be admired, a subtle but overwhelming declaration of absolute ownership. I slipped it on. It fit perfectly, the silk clinging to my curves in a way that made my breath hitch in my throat. When I walked back out into the dimly lit living room, he was waiting. He had shed his heavy winter coat and suit jacket, sitting relaxed in a leather armchair with a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. The moment he saw me in the burgundy dress, the glass halted halfway to his mouth. His obsidian eyes flared with a raw, unmasked hunger that made my pulse hammer violently against my throat. The unspoken subtext between us was unbearable. I was a broke, exhausted pediatric nurse drowning in medical debt. He was the sovereign of the city's criminal underworld. But in the quiet, isolated warmth of that penthouse, the sharp class disparity completely vanished, replaced by an electric, gravity-defying pull. He stood up, crossing the room with slow, deliberate predator steps until he was standing mere inches away from me. I could feel the intense heat radiating from his chest, smell the intoxicating blend of rich cedar and sharp gunpowder clinging to his skin. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a wet strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was so tender, so completely at odds with the violent reality of who he was, that it broke something open inside me. I had spent years being fiercely hyper-independent, carrying the entire world on my shoulders without a single point of safety. For one night, I desperately wanted to lay that massive burden down. For one night, I wanted to be held by someone strong enough to fight the entire world for me. When his lips finally crashed down onto mine, there was no hesitation. The kiss was a consuming fire, desperate and wildly possessive. He lifted me effortlessly against the wall, his hands mapping the curves of my body, with a frantic, breathless reverence. The tension that had been building since the alleyway snapped, plunging us into a passionate, chaotic tangle of silk, heated skin, and desperate sighs. We dismantled every boundary, surrendering entirely to the profound, aching intimacy of the dark room. He worshipped my exhausted body, treating me not like a disposable clinic employee, but like a queen he had spent his entire life searching for. But reality is always a cruel master. I woke up hours later, the penthouse entirely silent. The heavy blackout curtains were firmly drawn, but a tiny sliver of gray dawn light sliced across the massive rumpled bed. He was fast asleep beside me, his muscular chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. My heart ached with a sudden, suffocating affection as I watched his face, temporarily stripped of its ruthless mask. Then my eyes drifted to the dark mahogany nightstand. Resting casually next to his expensive watch was the matte black handgun, fully loaded. Beside it was a leather ledger, stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. The beautiful illusion of safety shattered instantly. I wasn't just a woman resting in a lover's bed. I was a civilian tangled in the dark sheets of a mafia boss. If I stayed, I would eventually become leverage. I would be dragged into a terrifying world of violence, surveillance, and constant threat. I couldn't survive that. My hard-earned pride, my independence, my very life would be completely consumed by his massive shadow. With shaking hands, I slipped out from under his heavy protective arm. I found my dried sneakers and my cheap purse near the door. Before I left, I noticed his wallet sitting open on the dresser. I didn't take a single dollar. I absolutely refused to be a transaction. Instead, I took the heavy black card resting beside it. His personal, direct line. A lifeline I swore I would never, ever use. I slipped out of the penthouse before the sun hit the imported white marble floors, vanishing into the early morning fog of Boston. I returned to my quiet, grueling life at the clinic, determined to forget the heat of his hands and the intoxicating illusion of his protection. I thought I had escaped clean. I thought it was just one singular, wild night that would eventually fade into a bittersweet memory. I had no idea that as I walked away from his fortress, I was already carrying his future heir. And now, 6 months later, leaning against the cold wall of the pediatric clinic, the secret was growing far too large to hide. The Ravellini card in my pocket felt like a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate my life. I squeezed my eyelids shut tightly, praying, to whatever forces were listening, that Alexander Ravellini would never walk through the clinic doors and see what my one night of weakness had created. I pulled my trembling fingers away from the heavy card hidden deep inside my scrub pocket. The intoxicating memory of the penthouse, the sharp scent of cedar, and the phantom heat of a ruthless man's hands dissolved instantly into the harsh, sterile reality of the city's underfunded youth ward. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless, annoying hum that drilled directly into my skull, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the peeling linoleum floor. I forced my posture straight, ignoring the sharp, grinding pain radiating from my lower spine. The baby was resting low today, a heavy solid weight pressing directly against my pelvis, making every step an exercise in endurance. I had a job to do, and I could not afford to lose it to the ghosts of my own reckless past. Single motherhood was a relentless tide, and I was drowning one unwashed dish at a time, or rather, one 12-hour shift at a time. I walked back to the central nursing station, a cramped semicircular desk piled high with disorganized manila folders, half-empty coffee cups, and a constantly ringing landline. I reached for a stack of blank discharge papers, desperate to keep my mind occupied and my hands moving. The routine usually anchored me. Sort the charts, update the vitals, dodge the overflowing trash cans. But before I could pull a pen from my pocket, a heavy palm slammed down flat on the imitation wood counter, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the heavy clipboard onto my swollen feet. Carl Miller had circled back. The clinic manager was holding a thin red folder with my name printed on the tab. His cheap cologne, A suffocating mixture of synthetic musk and stale peppermint made the morning nausea I had been fighting all day suddenly spike in the back of my throat. I swallowed hard against the bile. I took a deliberate, subtle step backward, creating a sliver of physical distance between us, while carefully maintaining the baggy folds of my navy scrubs over my abdomen. I should have known something was wrong when Miller insisted I submit to an on-site blood draw today, not the independent lab screening I had specifically requested to protect my privacy. At 26, I had learned to pick my battles. A simple paperwork dispute was rarely worth the argument, especially not today. Our understaffed shift demanded total focus, not administrative conflict. But the predatory gleam in his watery eyes signaled that this was not about corporate compliance. He thrived on intimidation, treating the nursing staff like disposable machinery. "We have a problem, Sterling," the manager said, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial volume that made my skin crawl. He tapped a manicured fingernail aggressively against a printed form inside the red folder. "The corporate office is auditing our health insurance this quarter. Every staff member is required to submit a biannual physical clearance. Your file is empty. You have successfully dodged the clinic physician for 3 consecutive months." I kept my expression entirely blank, locking my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. A mandatory clinic physical meant a mandatory blood test. A mandatory blood test meant my human chorionic gonadotropin levels would immediately flag on the system. The 6-month pregnancy I was desperately concealing to keep my income would become public knowledge by the end of the hour. Once Miller knew I was carrying a child, he would easily find a bureaucratic loophole to terminate my contract to avoid paying out any maternity benefits. He had done it to 2 other nurses last year, citing performance issues the moment they requested lighter lifting duties. "My medical records are private under federal law, Carl," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even, projecting a calm I absolutely did not feel. "I am fully compliant with the union regulations. I have 30 days from the final notice period to submit independent lab results from my own private physician. I will have the paperwork faxed to HR by Friday." Miller narrowed his eyes, leaning his upper body over the counter to invade my space. His gaze slowly dragged down from my tired face to the oversized, tent-like scrubs draped over my changing body. He did not know the truth yet, but he smelled a secret, and men like him lived to exploit the vulnerabilities of women who had no safety net. "You are hiding something, Teresa," he sneered, crossing his arms over his cheap suit jacket. "You look exhausted. Your uniform is practically falling off your shoulders, yet you move like you weigh an extra 20 pounds. Are you sick? Because I absolutely will not authorize extended paid sick leave for a nurse who refuses to use our own diagnostic facilities. If you don't sit in chair 3 and let the phlebotomist draw your blood by the end of this shift, I am suspending you without pay pending a corporate review." Panic, cold and sharp as cracked ice, bloomed in the center of my chest. Losing my paycheck meant losing my apartment. It meant failing the tiny, fragile life currently resting beneath my heart. The medical debt from my late mother's illness still hovered over my bank account like a guillotine. I opened my mouth to fight back, to cite the exact Massachusetts labor codes I had memorized during my sleepless nights, but a sudden violent commotion at the clinic entrance shattered the confrontation. The heavy electronic double doors crashed open, hitting the rubber stoppers with a deafening bang. A panicked father sprinted into the lobby, his clothes soaked from the freezing winter rain. In his arms was a little girl, no older than 7, her face a terrifying shade of pale blue. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving violently, but no sound was coming out. It was the absolute, unmistakable silence of a totally obstructed airway. The bureaucratic threat of Carl Miller ceased to exist. My professional training overrode my physical exhaustion in a split second. All the fear and anxiety of the last 5 minutes instantly vanished, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of pediatric emergency protocols. "Tridge Room 1 right now!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the noisy lobby with absolute authority. I shoved past the manager, nearly knocking his red folder to the floor, and sprinted down the hallway. The father practically threw the child onto the examination paper of the triage bed. The little girl's eyes were wide and filled with pure terror. Her lips were distinctly cyanotic, tinged with a dark, bruised blue. I grabbed my silver stethoscope, placing the cold bell directly against her frail chest. I didn't need to listen for long. There was no air movement, only a high-pitched, desperate stridor echoing from her upper airway. Severe asthma exacerbation. She was completely closing up. How long has she been struggling? I demanded, my hands moving with practiced mechanical efficiency. I slapped a pediatric pulse oximeter onto her tiny index finger. The monitor instantly wailed in alarm. Her oxygen saturation was at 82% and rapidly dropping. She was playing outside in the cold. The father stammered, his hands tearing at his wet hair. She left her inhaler at school. It just got worse so fast. Please, you have to help her. I need a high-flow oxygen mask and an albuterol nebulizer set up immediately. I barked over my shoulder to the junior nurse, hovering frozen in the doorway. When the girl didn't move fast enough, I lunged toward the supply cart myself. My swollen ankles screamed in protest, but I ignored the pain entirely. I ripped open the sterile packaging of a nebulizer cup, uncapping the plastic ampule of albuterol and squeezing the clear liquid into the chamber. I attached the corrugated tubing to the wall-mounted oxygen valve, twisting the green dial until the life-saving gas hissed loudly into the room. A thick, white medicinal mist immediately began to billow from the pediatric mask. I leaned over the bed, gently cupping the back of the little girl's head. Look at me, sweetheart. I know you're scared. I know it hurts. But I need you to take a deep breath of this magic mist for me. You are safe. I've got you. I secured the mask over her nose and mouth. The child fought it for a terrifying 3 seconds, her tiny hands clawing at the plastic, before her lungs instinctively pulled in the bronchodilator. I kept my hand firmly on her shoulder, murmuring quiet, rhythmic reassurances. I watched the tense, straining muscles between her ribs slowly begin to relax. 30 seconds later, a harsh, productive cough rattled through the plastic mask. The oxygen monitor beeped, the red numbers climbing agonizingly slow to 88, then 92, then 95%. The color began to flood back into her cheeks. The father collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the linoleum floor and burying his face in his hands as he sobbed in pure relief. I stood there for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the little girl's chest. My own breathing was ragged. Beneath the baggy fabric of my scrubs, my child shifted, delivering a strong, distinct kick against my ribs. It was a visceral reminder of exactly why I endured the degrading treatment, the bone-deep fatigue, and the constant fear. A mother's instinct to protect her child was a force of absolute nature. I would do anything, endure anything, to keep my baby safe from the violent world of the man whose blood flowed through its tiny veins. I would not let my child grow up looking over their shoulder for enemies they didn't create. Sterling. Miller's voice barked from the doorway, entirely ruining the sacred quiet moment of survival. He had not stepped in to help. He had merely observed the chaos from a safe distance, clutching his clipboard like a shield. Once she is stabilized, you need to ensure they fill out the correct insurance intake forms. We are not a free clinic, and don't think this little display of heroics changes our earlier conversation. I slowly removed the stethoscope from my ears, turning to look at the manager with a gaze so incredibly hollow and cold that he physically took a step back. I didn't say a single word. I simply held his eyes until he cleared his throat nervously and scurried back toward the administrative wing, his bravado crumbling against genuine, exhausted silence. I washed my trembling hands at the stainless steel sink, the icy water doing nothing to cool the adrenaline burning through my veins. I glanced at the wall clock. It was nearly 5 in the evening. Outside the frosted windows, the winter sky had already transitioned from a bleak gray to a pitch, suffocating black. The freezing rain continued to hammer the glass, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the building. Then, the atmosphere in the clinic changed. It did not happen slowly. It happened with a sudden, violent shift in air pressure that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at absolute attention. The steady, chaotic background noise of crying babies, ringing phones, and coughing toddlers was suddenly overpowered by a new, distinct sound vibrating through the thin walls of the building. It was the heavy, synchronized, low-frequency roar of massive engines. I turned away from the sink, a cold drop of sweat tracing a slow line down my spine. Through the frosted glass of the lobby windows, the blurry shapes of passing traffic were suddenly eclipsed by enormous, solid black shadows. Tires screeched violently against the wet asphalt. I heard the unmistakable heavy thud of multiple car doors slamming shut in perfect unison. The receptionist at the front desk stood up, her mouth falling open as she stared out the glass doors. She took one step backward, then another, before she let out a sharp, terrified scream. I moved purely on instinct, rushing out of the triage room and into the main corridor. 4 matte black, military-grade armored SUVs had completely blocked the 2-lane street outside the clinic. They were parked at sharp, aggressive angles, forming an impenetrable steel barricade against the pouring rain. The sheer contrast between the decaying, impoverished neighborhood and the staggering, terrifying wealth of those vehicles was paralyzing. My heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against my ribs. My hand flew to my stomach, my fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my scrubs. They found me. The terrifying thought consumed my entire brain. My carefully constructed life of invisibility had failed. The sovereign of the underworld had realized I took his card, tracked my location, and sent his soldiers to reclaim the woman who had dared to walk out of his gilded cage. But as the heavy electronic doors of the clinic were forcefully shoved open, the reality proved to be something entirely different and infinitely more dangerous. The freezing winter wind howled through the open doorway, scattering loose medical intake forms and promotional pamphlets across the wet linoleum floor. 6 men stepped into the brightly lit lobby. They were not standard police officers. They did not wear badges. They were massive, lethal men, dressed in dark tailored suits worn over heavy tactical vests. Water dripped from their broad shoulders as they moved with the predatory, synchronized grace of a highly trained execution squad. The patients in the waiting room screamed, grabbing their children and diving beneath the plastic chairs. Carl Miller emerged from his office, his face draining of all color. The manager opened his mouth to shout a demand, to assert his pathetic authority, but the words died instantly in his throat. Leading the tactical team was a man who commanded absolute silence. Dante Russo. I recognized him instantly. I had seen him standing in the shadows of the penthouse on that singular, fateful night 6 months ago. Dante was the tactician, the silent phantom, the bodyguard who handled the violent logistics of the Ravellini Empire. He wore a bespoke black suit that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light of the clinic. A discreet communication earpiece rested in his left ear. In his hands, held at a low, ready angle that spoke of terrifying proficiency, was a compact, suppressed assault rifle. No one moves. No one screams. This facility is now under temporary absolute lockdown, Dante announced. His voice was not loud, but the dead, gravelly calm in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. It was the voice of a man who considered human life a simple matter of mathematics. The clinic froze. The weeping mothers clamped their hands over their own mouths. Carl Miller pressed his back against the reception desk, his knees visibly shaking as he stared at the heavily armed men securing the exits. I backed up slowly, silently, merging into the shadows of the hallway. I pulled the junior nurse with me, pressing her behind my body to shield her. My breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. I stared at the lapel of Dante's suit jacket. Pinned to the dark fabric was a small, heavy gold crest, the exact same crest that was daisy stamped onto the black Ravellini card currently resting in my pocket. They were not here to hunt a runaway nurse. Men of this caliber, operating with this level of overwhelming public force, only mobilized for one reason: a high-level security threat. A territorial war had spilled over, or an assassination attempt had gone wrong in the streets of Boston, and they were securing the nearest medical facility by absolute force. Dante signaled to his men with a sharp flick of his wrist. The soldiers immediately fanned out, pulling down the heavy metal security blinds over the windows, plunging the clinic into an eerie, artificial twilight. They locked the front doors, standing guard with their weapons resting casually against their chests. The absolute violation of our safe, sterile medical space was complete. Dante paced slowly toward the center of the lobby, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the terrified faces of the medical staff. His gaze swept right past me, registering me as nothing more than another frightened civilian in oversized scrubs. The relief that washed over me was so intense my knees nearly buckled. I was still invisible. The tactician raised his left hand, pressing 2 fingers against his earpiece. The silence in the clinic was so profound I could hear the rain lashing against the metal blinds. The perimeter is entirely locked down. The civilian medical staff is secured. Dante spoke into the radio, his voice a chilling monotone that echoed off the pale yellow walls. He paused, listening to a response I could not hear, before giving the final terrifying command. "Bring him in." My blood crystallized in my veins. The electronic doors were forced open one more time. The freezing wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain, expensive cedar, and incoming devastation. I pressed my back hard against the wall, my hand instinctively curving fiercely over my hidden child, realizing with absolute, horrifying certainty that my two worlds had just violently collided. The heavy electronic doors parted, groaning in mechanical protest against the forceful gust of freezing Boston winter wind. Following Dante's chilling command, the next wave of figures breached the compromised sanctuary of the clinic. A towering tactical soldier rushed in, his heavy combat boots squeaking against the wet linoleum, carrying a small pale child wrapped securely in a thick, blood-spotted tactical jacket. It was Enzo Ravellini, the 5-year-old nephew of the sovereign. The boy was not crying, but his dark eyes were wide with a silent, traumatized shock, a stark contrast to the aggressive, kinetic chaos exploding around him. The armed soldiers moved with absolute, brutal efficiency, clearing the central lobby and forcing the weeping patients to the far corners of the room with sharp, synchronized hand gestures. But my focus did not remain on the injured boy or the heavily armed men securing the perimeter. My entire world narrowed, shrinking down to the towering, devastating silhouette that stepped casually through the doorway immediately behind them. Alexander. He was a walking manifestation of absolute, terrifying power. The fluorescent clinic lights, usually harsh and unforgiving, seemed to dim in deference to his overwhelming presence. He wore a bespoke charcoal wool topcoat that fell past his knees, the expensive, heavy fabric completely impervious to the freezing rain outside. Beneath it, his dark suit was tailored to lethal perfection, emphasizing the broad, muscular shoulders that had once sheltered me in a dark, blood-soaked alleyway. His jaw was locked tight, the familiar, dangerous muscle ticking rapidly near his ear. His tempestuous gaze swept over the terrified crowd, calculating threats, analyzing the room with the cold, detached precision of an apex predator. He was here to oversee the medical care of his bloodline. He was here to ensure this fragile clinic was transformed into an impenetrable fortress while his trauma surgeons stabilized the boy. He had no idea I worked here. He had absolutely no idea I even existed within a 10-mile radius of this decaying, underfunded medical facility. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying for a miracle of invisibility. I flattened my spine against the pale yellow wall of the hallway, pulling the junior nurse entirely in front of me to act as a human shield. The rough texture of the peeling paint bit through the thin, cheap fabric of my oversized scrubs. I held my breath, my lungs burning with the desperate, agonizing need for oxygen, my hands firmly clasped over the rounded swell of my abdomen. The baby, agitated by my sudden, massive spike in biological adrenaline, delivered a sharp, rolling kick against my ribs. I winced silently, rubbing a soothing thumb over the hidden bump, silently promising my unborn child that we would survive this night, just as we had survived the last 6 months. Alexander issued a series of low, gravelly commands to Dante. His voice, that dark, vibrating baritone that had haunted my dreams for 6 consecutive months, echoed through the sterile lobby. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience, vibrating with a deadly authority that left no room for hesitation. The soldiers moved instantly, carrying the silent, wide-eyed Enzo toward examination room 2, where the emergency equipment was prepped. I watched the boy from the shadows, my pediatric nursing instincts warring violently with my primal need to hide. I could see the shallow rise of the child's chest, the pallor of his skin suggesting localized trauma rather than systemic shock. I recognized the precise shade of his pallor, the body's immediate physiological response to extreme stress, prioritizing blood flow to the core organs. My clinical mind automatically cataloged his symptoms. I noted the lack of cyanosis around his lips, the steady rhythm of his breathing despite the terrifying environment. He needed a thorough neurological check, a warm blanket to prevent heat loss, and a quiet, sterile space away from the noise of the tactical team. I knew exactly where the pediatric intubation kits were stored. I knew the exact protocol for pediatric trauma. Every fiber of my professional training screamed at me to step forward, to offer my expertise, to assist the traumatized child. But stepping forward meant stepping into the light. It meant exposing the very secret I had sacrificed everything to protect. It meant handing my hard-won independence over to a man who ruled the city by force. Alexander turned his head to follow their path down the corridor. And then, the universe completely collapsed. As he pivoted, his stormy gaze dragged across the deep shadows of the hallway. They swept past the trembling receptionist hiding under her desk. They dismissed the cowering, pathetic figure of Carl Miller pressing himself into a corner. And then, they stopped. They locked directly onto my face. The atmosphere in the clinic did not just change, it shattered. The ambient noise, the wailing infants, the hum of the broken heating vent, the heavy thud of combat boots, was instantly sucked out of the room, leaving a deafening, highly pressurized vacuum. It felt like a predator had just revealed itself, and every prey animal in the vicinity suddenly remembered what fear tasted like. The sovereign of the Boston underworld, a man who never hesitated, who never showed a single fraction of surprise, went completely, unnervingly still. Across 30 feet of scuffed linoleum, the electric gravity-defying pull that had ignited in his penthouse 6 months ago flared to life with terrifying, undeniable violence. I could not look away. I was paralyzed, trapped entirely in the crosshairs of his obsidian gaze. I saw the exact defining moment the recognition hit him. The initial flash of sheer disbelief was quickly overridden by a dark, consuming intensity that made my blood run cold. He cataloged the dark, purple shadows under my eyes, the dullness of my exhausted features, the slight, uncontrollable tremble in my fingers, and the defensive posture I had adopted. His gaze was methodical, a relentless physical assessment that missed absolutely nothing. And then, inevitably, his eyes dragged slowly, deliberately upward. He saw the way I was standing. He saw the defensive, desperate curve of my arms folded protectively over my torso. He saw the unmistakable, protruding shape of a 6-month pregnancy, straining against the navy blue fabric of my uniform. I watched the devastating mathematical calculation happen in real time behind his eyes. Summer to winter, 6 months, the singular, passionate night in the penthouse, the sudden, inexplicable disappearance at dawn, the missing woman, the child, his child. The rigid line of his posture shifted into something entirely predatory, an icy tension locking his broad shoulders. His hands, previously resting loose and relaxed at his sides, clenched into massive, white-knuckled fists. The shift in his demeanor was so sudden, so profoundly terrifying, that even Dante noticed the disruption. The silent tactician turned his head, following his boss's direct line of sight, his gloved hand tightening marginally on the grip of his suppressed rifle. Alexander did not draw his weapon. He did not shout. He simply began to walk toward me. Every step he took was a measured predatory advancement that consumed the remaining oxygen in the hallway. The crowd of civilians instinctively parted for him, scrambling backward to avoid the suffocating aura of danger, rolling off his broad shoulders. Miller, oblivious to the silent, monumental shift in the room's dynamic, made the fatal, idiotic mistake of stepping directly into Alexander's path. "Sir, you cannot access the staff corridors without proper corporate clearance," the manager stammered, holding up his pathetic plastic clipboard like a useless shield, completely failing to read the lethal warning signs. "We are operating under strict liability protocols, and if you do not immediately vacate this premises, I will be forced to contact the local authorities. You are disrupting a high-volume medical facility." Alexander's expression didn't even shift. He didn't break eye contact with me for a single microsecond. The threat of local authorities meant absolutely nothing to a man who owned the judges and paid the police commissioners. He merely lifted his right hand and shoved the manager aside, with a casual, devastating force that sent Miller crashing violently into a row of metal filing cabinets. The heavy steel dented inward with a sickening crunch. Patient files scattered across the wet linoleum like confetti, as the manager collapsed in a pathetic heap of cheap cologne, crumpled paperwork, and bruised ego. Not a single heavily armed soldier even blinked. They remained perfectly still, a silent testament to the absolute authority of the man walking toward me. He stopped less than 2 feet away from me. The heat radiating from his large frame was overwhelming, completely overriding the suffocating 80-degree temperature of the clinic. The intoxicating scent of winter rain, rich cedar, and expensive tobacco wrapped around me like a heavy familiar blanket. Up close, the lethal perfection of his face was paralyzing. His piercing gray eyes were fully dilated, the dark pupils swallowing the iris as they burned with an absolute primal fury. But it was not the fury of a man who had been lied to. It was the apocalyptic, earth-shattering wrath of a sovereign who had just found his most precious vulnerability standing unprotected in a battlefield. He reached out, his massive scarred hand gripping my upper arm. His touch was firm, inescapable but remarkably gentle, lacking any intent to bruise my skin. "Exam room 1, now." He issued the command in a low, gravelly vibration that rattled my ribcage and demanded absolute submission. Before I could process the order or formulate a protest, he was already moving, pulling me effortlessly out of the hallway shadows. I stumbled slightly on my swollen feet, but his grip instantly stabilized me, bearing my extra weight with staggering, infuriating ease. He guided me into the small, sterile space where I had just assessed the asthmatic child mere minutes ago. The moment we crossed the threshold, he kicked the heavy wooden door shut behind us, the latch clicking with an agonizing finality that severed us from the chaotic clinic outside. The small examination room suddenly felt microscopic, its 4 pale yellow walls closing in on us. The sharp, clinical scent of isopropyl alcohol, dried adhesive tape, and cherry-flavored pediatric syrup was entirely drowned out by his dark, suffocating presence. I backed up until my spine hit the cold, unforgiving edge of the stainless steel sink. I did not cower. Instead, I tightened my fingers around the edge of the adjacent medical tray, my knuckles turning white, and forced myself to hold his stormy gaze with every ounce of defiant professionalism I possessed. The silver stethoscope around my neck felt heavy, strikingly different from the burning heat radiating from the man standing before me. Every instinct I possessed urged me to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. The heavy, gold-embossed Ravellini card felt like a burning brand in my pocket, a constant reminder of the safety I had stubbornly rejected to maintain my autonomy. Alexander stood by the door, his broad shoulders completely blocking my only exit. For a long, agonizing minute, he said absolutely nothing. He just looked at me. His gaze was a physical weight, mapping the dark purple shadows of chronic insomnia under my eyes, the hollows of my cheeks, and the cheap, frayed edges of my medical scrubs. Then, he looked down at my stomach, staring at the physical evidence of his legacy hidden beneath the cheap cotton. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. I instinctively pressed myself harder against the sink, my heart hammering a frantic bird-like rhythm against my sternum. 6 months, he said softly. The quietness of his tone was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. It carried the dangerous, highly pressurized weight of a bomb seconds away from detonating. You spent 6 months in this filthy, decaying building. You stood on your feet for 12 hours a day, treating strangers, breathing in disease while carrying my child. I was protecting my child, I fired back, my voice trembling but fiercely refusing to break. The primal, maternal instinct that had driven my every exhausting action since that night 6 months ago flared up, pushing past my terror. I was protecting my independence. I didn't want this baby to grow up surrounded by bodyguards, armored cars, and blood on the floor. I wanted a normal life. I wanted peace. I wanted to be a mother who didn't have to explain to her child why his father carried a suppressed weapon in his tailored coat. Alexander closed the remaining distance between us with 2 long strides. He towered over me, a dark monolith of power, control, and absolute possession. "Look around you, Teresa," he murmured, his breath brushing warm against my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. He gestured sharply toward the cracked linoleum, the rusted faucet, the thin, uninsulated walls that were currently surrounded by a tactical hit squad. "Is this your definition of safety? You are completely exhausted. You are malnourished. Your corrupt manager was moments away from firing you, because you couldn't hide the physical toll of carrying a Ravellini heir. You chose the dangerous illusion of poverty over the absolute reality of my protection. Your protection comes with a cage," I whispered, gripping the cold metal of the tray to keep my hands from shaking. "I took your card. I kept it in my pocket every single day, but I swore I would never use it. I am not a transaction, Alexander. I am a highly trained pediatric nurse. I know how to survive on my own." "You survived," he agreed, his eyes darkening to a shade of pure obsidian as they locked onto mine. "But mere survival is not living. You have spent half a year rationing prenatal vitamins, fighting off opportunistic managers, and working double shifts until your joints scream. And it is entirely, unequivocally unacceptable for the mother of my child to suffer." He reached out, I gasped, bracing for him to grab my shoulders or trap my arms, but his hands bypassed my defenses entirely. He brought both of his large, scarred palms down to rest directly on my swollen abdomen. The intense heat of his touch seared through the thin navy fabric, sending a violent electric shock straight to my core. The friction of his callous skin against the cotton sent a jolt of electricity down my spine, overriding every instinct that told me to pull away. The moment his hands settled over the baby, a profound, heavy silence fell over the tiny examination room. The apocalyptic fury radiating from him instantly dissolved, replaced by a raw, suffocating reverence that made my throat ache with unshed tears. He closed his eyes, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, ragged breath. He was the most dangerous man in the city, a sovereign who commanded an empire of violence and shadows. Yet he was standing in a cheap clinic room, completely anchored by the tiny, fragile life hidden beneath his palms. As if on cue, the baby shifted. A strong, distinct kick pushed outward, pressing directly against the center of his right palm. Alexander's eyes snapped open. The stoic, ruthless mask of the Mafia Boss completely shattered, revealing a man who had just been handed the entire universe. His jaw tightened, an uncompromising, fierce territorial devotion flooding his gaze. The romantic tension, long suppressed under months of fear and sheer physical exhaustion, flared to life, heavy and undeniable. "My child," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a sacred, unbreakable vow. He moved his hands, his thumbs gently stroking the curve of my stomach with an agonizingly tender precision. Then he looked up, his gaze locking onto mine with absolute, uncompromising authority. "You thought you were hiding from me, Teresa. You thought you were keeping him safe by working yourself into the ground. But you are mine, and from this exact second forward, your struggle is permanently over." "Alexander, you can't just uproot my life," I protested weakly, my voice barely a breath in the charged air. "I have a lease. I have patients who rely on me. I have a life here. You cannot just walk in after 6 months and erase my entire existence with a single command." "I can, and I will," he interrupted smoothly, his tone shifting into a low, velvet command that left absolutely no room for debate. He stepped closer, eliminating the last fraction of space between us, the expensive wool of his bespoke coat brushing against my worn scrubs. "I am taking you out of this decaying building. I am putting you in a fortress where no one will ever raise their voice to you again. You will never look at another medical bill. You will never stand on swollen feet for 12 hours just to survive. You are coming home with me. I don't need your charity. I tried one last time, my stubborn pride fighting a losing battle against the overwhelming exhaustion in my bones." I stared at the silver stethoscope draped around my neck, the ultimate symbol of my self-reliance, feeling the last remnants of my independent defenses crumbling. "It is not charity. It is my sovereign duty," he replied, his hand moving from my stomach to gently cup the side of my face. His thumb traced the dark circle under my eye, a gesture so profoundly tender it made my heart hammer a wild, frantic rhythm against my ribs. The rough, callous texture of his skin against my cheek was exactly as I remembered it from the penthouse. A dangerous, thrilling contradiction to the ruthless violence he was capable of unleashing on the world. He was a monster to his enemies, but to me in this tiny, sterile room, he was a shield. "You carried my legacy in the shadows for 6 months, bearing a weight you were never meant to carry alone. Now, I will carry you now, permanently." He didn't wait for my consent. He didn't ask for my surrender. The grueling, exhausting era of hiding was officially over, and the terrifying, beautiful reality of his absolute protection had just begun. He moved with a sudden, fluid grace that completely belied his massive, towering frame. Before my exhausted brain could fully process the gravity of his declaration, Alexander stepped into my personal space and simply bent down. One of his large, calloused hands slid firmly beneath the back of my knees, while his other arm wrapped securely around the center of my spine. I let out a sharp, involuntary gasp as the cold linoleum floor abruptly fell away from my swollen feet. The physical relief was so instantaneous and profound that it was terrifying. For 12 grueling hours, my lower back had been trapped in a slow-turning vice of agony, every vertebra grinding together, under the compounding weight of my 6-month pregnancy, and the relentless demands of the pediatric shift. The moment he lifted me against his broad chest, that crushing pressure evaporated. My spine finally uncoiled. The dull, throbbing pain in my ankles vanished, replaced by the sheer, intoxicating sensation of weightlessness. I was entirely supported by a man whose physical strength was so overwhelming it made my own fierce, stubborn independence feel completely unnecessary. I instinctively looped my arms around his thick neck to steady myself, my fingers brushing against the crisp collar of his bespoke suit. The silver stethoscope draped around my shoulders clinked softly against the dark buttons of his jacket. A pathetic, tiny sound of medical protocol, surrendering to absolute underworld authority. I pressed my cheek against the heavy charcoal wool of his topcoat, instantly enveloped in the intoxicating, familiar scent of winter rain, rich cedar, and expensive tobacco. It was the exact same scent that had haunted my empty apartment for half a year. Alexander did not struggle with my added weight in the slightest. He carried me with a possessive, effortless ease, as if I were nothing more than a precious, fragile artifact he had finally reclaimed from a careless museum. He turned toward the examination room door, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line of pure determination. When he kicked the heavy wooden door open and carried me back out into the main corridor, the entire clinic was completely silent. The ambient chaos of the medical facility had been entirely suppressed by the lethal presence of the Ravellini tactical squad. The heavily armed soldiers stood at perfect attention along the perimeter, their suppressed weapons held at the low ready. Dante Russo stood near the shattered metal filing cabinets, his dark, calculating eyes scanning the exits with mechanical precision. The junior nurses and the terrified receptionist were huddled behind the main desk, their eyes wide with sheer disbelief, as they watched the city's reigning crime lord carry their exhausted, pregnant coworker through the hallway. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of vulnerability. My carefully constructed invisibility was being publicly, violently dismantled. I buried my face a fraction deeper into the lapel of his coat, closing my eyes against the staring crowd. His arm tightened around my waist in an immediate, silent response to my anxiety, pulling me closer to the radiating heat of his chest. But our exit was not entirely unobstructed. From the wreckage of scattered patient files and dented steel, Carl Miller pushed himself up off the floor. The corrupt clinic manager was trembling, his cheap suit jacket torn at the shoulder from where Alexander had effortlessly discarded him minutes prior. His slicked-back hair was a chaotic mess, a strand hanging pathetically across his sweaty forehead. He should have stayed down. He should have recognized the absolute, apocalyptic danger radiating from the man carrying me. But Miller was a creature built on petty corporate tyranny, and his bruised ego desperately demanded a final, idiotic attempt at reclaiming his shattered authority in front of his staff. "You cannot just walk out of here with her." Miller stammered, his voice cracking midway through the sentence as he took a hesitant step forward, pointing a trembling finger in our direction. "Sterling is on the clock. This is a severe violation of her employment contract. If she leaves this facility before her shift is officially transferred, it is considered job abandonment. I will terminate her medical insurance. I will blacklist nursing license across the entire state board." Alexander stopped walking. He did not set me down. He did not raise his voice. He merely turned his head, looking over his shoulder at the manager, with a gaze so incredibly devoid of human empathy that the ambient temperature in the hallway seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Dante immediately shifted his stance, his gloved hand resting deliberately over the pistol, holstered at his hip, waiting for a single nod from his boss to execute a permanent solution. "You will do absolutely nothing," Alexander stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated deeply through his chest and directly into my own. The quietness of his tone was far more devastating than any shout could ever be. "You measure human lives in 15-minute increments and threaten pregnant women to protect your pathetic profit margins. You operate under the delusion that your corporate policies offer you a shield against the real world." Miller swallowed hard, the last remnants of color draining entirely from his face, as the reality of his situation finally pierced his bureaucratic arrogance. He took a stumbling step backward, his hands raising defensively. "By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, my legal division will have purchased the parent company that owns this decaying building." Alexander continued, his words slicing through the sterile air with absolute, surgical precision. "By noon, the board of directors will unanimously vote to terminate your contract without severance. And if I ever hear that you have so much as spoken Teresa's name again, I will not bother sending my lawyers. I will send Dante. Do you understand the mathematics of your current situation, Mr. Miller?" The manager's knees visibly buckled. He could not even formulate a verbal response. He simply nodded, a jerky, terrified motion, before shrinking back against the wall, completely broken and humiliated in front of the very staff he had terrorized for years. The poetic justice of his instant, absolute ruin was staggering. The man who had threatened my survival for 6 months was erased from my life in less than 60 seconds. Alexander turned away from the pathetic display, his attention dismissing the manager entirely, as he resumed his long, measured strides toward the clinic entrance. Dante moved seamlessly ahead of us, pushing the heavy electronic double doors wide open. The freezing New England winter night hit my face the moment we crossed the threshold. The wind howled through the narrow city streets, driving straight sheets of icy rain sideways against the pavement. But the brutal weather did not touch me. Alexander's broad shoulders shielded the brunt of the storm, and a tactical soldier instantly stepped forward with a massive black umbrella, completely covering us as we moved toward the convoy. The four matte black, military-grade armored SUVs idled aggressively at the curb, their heavy tires sitting in deep puddles of freezing water. Dante opened the reinforced rear door of the lead vehicle. The interior was a cavern of dark, immaculate luxury, vastly unlike the decaying poverty of the clinic behind us. Alexander ducked beneath the doorframe, depositing me onto the plush, heated leather seat with extreme agonizing care. He did not let go of me immediately. He kept his hands securely on my waist until he was certain I was balanced, his dark eyes scanning my face for any signs of physical distress. Then, he slid into the vehicle right beside me, the massive door closing behind him with a heavy, pressurized thud that instantly severed us from the outside world. The acoustic isolation of the armored cabin was absolute. The howling wind, the relentless rain, and the distant wailing of city sirens were completely erased. The silence inside the SUV was heavy, thick with the scent of new leather, expensive cedar, and the overwhelming reality of what had just occurred. Dante climbed into the driver's seat behind the thick, tinted ballistic glass of the privacy partition. The massive engine let out a low, predatory growl as the vehicle smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving that decaying medical facility and my entire former life in the rearview mirror. I stared blankly at the glowing dashboard lights, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright for the past hour suddenly crashing down around me in a violent wave. The sheer magnitude of my new reality slammed into my chest. I had no keys. I had no winter coat. I had left a cheap canvas purse sitting in the nursing station locker. I was sitting in the back of a Mafia Sovereign's armored convoy in nothing but a pair of oversized, damp medical scrubs, carrying his unborn child. My lungs tightened. The air in the spacious cabin suddenly felt far too thin. A harsh, jagged breath ripped through my throat, and my hands began to tremble violently. The hyper-independent shield I had carried for 6 months was shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces, leaving me exposed, terrified, and completely out of control. Alexander noticed the physiological shift instantly. He didn't offer a useless platitude. He didn't tell me to calm down. He moved with tactical, deliberate precision to ground me. He unbuttoned his heavy charcoal topcoat, shedding the expensive garment and draping it entirely over my shivering shoulders. The residual heat from his body was trapped in the thick wool, enveloping me in a sudden overwhelming cocoon of warmth. Then, he reached across the leather seat, capturing both of my trembling hands in his massive, scarred palms. His grip was firm, anchoring me to the physical present. He began to rub his thumbs slowly, methodically over my freezing knuckles, forcing warmth back into my sluggish circulation. "Breathe, Teresa," he murmured, his tone a deep, steady rumble in the quiet cabin. "You are spiraling into shock, look at me. Focus entirely on my voice." I forced my eyes up to meet his. The apocalyptic fury that had burned in his stormy gray gaze back in the clinic was completely gone. In its place was a profound, suffocating tenderness that made my chest ache with a sudden, desperate need to cry. "I don't have my things," I whispered, my voice cracking pitifully as a single humiliating tear spilled over my lower lash line. "My apartment keys, my mother's necklace. I left everything in my locker. My landlord is going to evict me by Friday, if I don't physically hand him the rent check." "Your apartment is already being handled," Alexander replied smoothly, his thumbs never stopping their rhythmic, soothing motion across the back of my hands. "Dante dispatched a secondary team 10 minutes ago. They are packing every single item in your residence. Nothing will be left behind. Your landlord has been paid in full for the remainder of the year, to break the lease quietly. Your medical debt from the state hospital has been completely zeroed out." I stared at him, the logistical impossibility of his words tangling in my exhausted mind. "You can't just erase my debts. You can't just buy my life." "I am not buying your life. I am securing it," he corrected, his tone shifting into something fiercely protective. He shifted closer, pulling my hands gently against the center of his chest. I could feel the strong, even, heavy thud of his heart beneath his dress shirt. "You have spent the last 6 months operating in a state of constant, solitary survival. You built a wall of extreme independence because the people who were supposed to protect you failed. But you are not alone anymore. You will never be alone again. I'm terrified." "Alexander," I confessed, the brutal honesty tearing its way out of my throat before I could stop it. The admission was the hardest thing I had ever spoken out loud. I ran from your penthouse because I saw the weapon. I saw the blood on the ledger. I am a pediatric nurse. I heal children. I cannot raise my baby in a world where we have to look over our shoulders for retaliation every time we step outside. He went incredibly still. The muscle near his jaw ticked, a physical manifestation of the immense restraint he was exercising. He did not pull away from my accusation. He absorbed it, his expression hardening with a dark, uncompromising resolve. My world is violent, he acknowledged, lowering his pitch to a somber, gravelly whisper that filled the quiet cabin. I will never lie to you about the nature of my empire. But the violence I command is exactly what will ensure that this child never knows a single day of fear. The men who guard my properties are ghosts. The perimeter of my sanctuary is impenetrable. I am not locking you away in a cage, Teresa. I am placing you in the absolute center of a fortress, and I will personally burn this entire city to ash before I let a single threat cross your threshold. He released my left hand, moving his large palm to rest deliberately, heavily over the curve of my stomach. The heat of his touch permeated the oversized scrubs and the heavy wool coat, sinking deep into my skin. Inside the quiet darkness of my womb, the baby responded to the familiar pressure. A soft, rolling flutter pressed back against his hand. Alexander closed his eyes for a long, heavy second, absorbing the tactile reality of the life we had created. When he opened them again, the raw, unfiltered devotion shining in the depths of his obsidian gaze took my breath away. It was a look of total surrender from a man who had never yielded to anyone in his entire life. I have spent my years acquiring power, territory, and leverage, Alexander said softly, his thumb tracing a protective arc over my abdomen. But none of it mattered until I walked into that decaying clinic and saw you standing there carrying my future. You are my only priority now, both of you. He leaned in, closing the final inch of space between us. He didn't kiss my lips. Instead, he pressed his mouth firmly against my forehead, lingering there in a silent, unbreakable vow of permanent guardianship. The tension that had held my spine rigid for 6 agonizing months finally snapped completely. I let out a long, shuddering sigh, resting my heavy, exhausted head against his shoulder. The scent of cedar and the rhythmic hum of the armored vehicle's engine enveloped me in an extreme, unconditional safety fantasy that I could no longer fight. The grueling war of my single motherhood was officially over. The reign of the sovereign's family had begun. The armored SUV descended smoothly into the subterranean parking level of the Beacon Hill high-rise, the heavy tires rolling to a quiet, definitive stop on the pristine, climate-controlled concrete. The abrupt transition from the chaotic, freezing streets of Boston to this silent, subterranean fortress was entirely jarring to my exhausted nervous system. My previous world had been all blaring sirens, icy drafts, and the constant, crushing pressure of medical debt. This world was silent, secure, and absolute. Alexander did not wait for his security detail to open my door. He bypassed Dante Russo and the other men, stepping out into the brightly lit garage and circling the massive vehicle with predatory grace to personally assist me. His large, scarred hand firmly enveloped mine, pulling me gently from the plush leather seat and stabilizing my swollen, aching ankles before I could even stumble. The sheer size of him, wrapped in that bespoke suit, was a stark contrast to my fragile, exhausted state. He guided me toward a set of reinforced steel elevator doors. He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner, hidden seamlessly within the polished metal panel. A faint electronic chime echoed in the cavernous garage, and the heavy doors slid open to reveal a private, mahogany-paneled car. As the elevator began its rapid, silent ascent, swallowing my stomach with the sudden shift in altitude, I leaned heavily against the solid wall of his chest. The heavy charcoal topcoat he had draped over my shoulders was still radiating his body heat, enveloping me in the intoxicating, masculine scent of winter rain, rich cedar, and expensive tobacco. It was the scent of the night my life had changed forever, returning now as a permanent shield. When the doors finally parted, stepping directly into the foyer of his penthouse, the sensory shock was absolute. The silence in the massive penthouse was not empty. It was heavy, protective, and tasted of clean ozone and absolute security. The transition was a staggering smash cut from the grimy, fluorescent-lit corridors of my former workplace to an impenetrable fortress of wealth. My previous apartment in South Boston had been a cramped, drafty box of constant anxiety. It featured a radiator, that clanged like a hammer against a pipe every 40 minutes, a window frame that leaked freezing rainwater onto warped floorboards, and a deadbolt that constantly jammed when my hands were shaking. Here, the reality was entirely different. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering, snow-blurred skyline of the city, the brutal storm outside rendered completely mute by 3 inches of bulletproof glass. The expansive floors were laid with imported black granite, gleaming perfectly under the soft, recessed amber lighting. It was a fortress designed by a sovereign, built explicitly to keep the violence of his empire out, and the sanctity of his private life completely untouched. Alexander led me down a wide, softly lit corridor, his hand resting securely against the small of my aching back. My mind was still violently spinning, trying to process the logistical impossibility of his promises in the armored vehicle. $43,250. That was the staggering, suffocating sum of my late mother's oncology bills that had been mercilessly garnishing my meager clinic wages for the past 2 years. The state hospital collection agency had threatened me with legal action just last Tuesday. Now, with a single gravelly command from the man walking beside me, that massive financial guillotine had been completely dismantled. It was a terrifying testament to his absolute, unchecked power. I had spent 6 months drowning in a relentless tide of poverty, counting quarters for the subway and rationing prenatal vitamins, completely unaware that my salvation required nothing more than his signature. It felt entirely unearned, yet I was too desperately tired to reject the lifeline he had thrown. He stopped in front of a set of towering double doors, pushing them open to reveal the master suite. The room was expansive, anchored by a massive king-sized bed draped in heavy, silver-gray silk and thick cashmere throws. A modern fireplace flickered against the far wall, casting a warm, golden glow across the immaculate space. The sheer luxury of the room was overwhelming, the absolute antithesis of the faded, second-hand furniture of my past. "The ensuite bathroom is through there," Alexander murmured, his words forming a gentle, soothing rumble in the quiet room. He did not cross the threshold with me. He remained standing in the hallway, offering me the one thing I desperately needed more than anything else: physical autonomy. "There are fresh towels and clothes waiting on the vanity. Take your time, Teresa. The perimeter is entirely locked down. No one is coming through those doors." I nodded, my throat too tight to formulate a verbal response, and walked into the bathroom. The space was a masterpiece of white marble and polished chrome, featuring a massive soaking tub and a glass-enclosed rainfall shower. I turned the brushed steel faucet, letting the scalding hot water begin to fill the basin. With trembling fingers, I peeled off the damp, oversized navy scrubs that had served as my only armor for the past half-year. They dropped to the heated marble floor in a pathetic, exhausted heap. I stared at the discarded uniform, realizing that my time at the clinic under Carl Miller's tyrannical rule was permanently over. I caught my reflection in the massive, fogging mirror. I looked like a casualty of war. Dark, purple shadows bruised the delicate skin under my eyes, a testament to months of chronic insomnia and hypervigilant terror. My collarbones were sharp, highlighting the malnourishment I had endured to ensure my unborn child received every available nutrient. And there, curving outward with undeniable, beautiful prominence, was my 6-month pregnant belly. I placed my hands over the taut skin, feeling the steady, reassuring warmth of the life growing inside me. The baby had finally stopped its frantic kicking, seemingly lulled into a peaceful state by the sudden absence of my maternal cortisol spikes. We were safe. The realization was a heavy, suffocating blanket of relief. After a long, restorative soak in the steaming water, the deep, agonizing ache in my lower lumbar spine finally began to recede. I stepped out, wrapping myself in a thick, heated towel. Resting precisely on the center of the dark mahogany vanity was a set of folded clothing. It was not the breathtaking burgundy silk dress he had provided on our first night together, a garment designed for seduction and possession. This was entirely different. It was a pair of wide-leg cashmere trousers, and an oversized heavy-knit sweater in a soft cream color. It was clothing explicitly designed for warmth, for extreme comfort, and for the delicate accommodation of a changing maternal body. The meticulous, observant care behind the gesture made my chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming affection. I dressed quickly, the impossibly soft cashmere yielding against my skin like a physical embrace. When I walked back out into the master bedroom, the heavy blackout curtains had been drawn, plunging the vast space into a deep, restful twilight. Alexander was waiting near the fireplace, holding a crystal glass of room-temperature water. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. The crisp white fabric of his dress shirt stretched taut across his broad shoulders. The holster strapped over his ribs was a sharp visual reminder of the violence he wielded to keep this sanctuary intact. He handed me the glass, his fingers briefly brushing against mine. The electric spark of his touch was instantaneous, sending a jolt of heat straight down my spine. "Drink," he commanded softly. "Your cellular hydration levels are severely depleted." I drank the water. It tasted pure, completely devoid of the metallic, rusted tang of the clinic's plumbing. When I handed the empty glass back to him, the absolute exhaustion of the day finally crashed down upon my nervous system like a collapsed building. My knees buckled slightly. Alexander was there before I could fall, his strong arms catching me and lifting me effortlessly onto the edge of the massive bed. He pulled back the heavy silk duvet, gently guiding my legs under the covers. He did not climb in beside me. He simply pulled the cashmere throw over my shoulders, his hand lingering for a brief, reverent second against my cheek. "Sleep, Teresa," he whispered, his dark irises locked onto mine in the dim light. "I am right outside." I rested my vision, the silver stethoscope resting safely on the sand beside me, and for the first time in 6 months, I surrendered completely to the dark. Sunlight filtered through curtains the color of champagne, soft and golden and completely unfamiliar. My eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding my waking thoughts before the sensory memory of the previous night rushed back in a powerful flood. The terrifying clinic lockdown, the apocalyptic fury in Alexander's eyes, the armored SUV, the absolute destruction of Carl Miller's pathetic career. I inhaled deeply, the crisp scent of fresh linen and expensive cedar filling my lungs. I was lying in the center of the massive bed. I turned my head, noting a slight, cool indentation on the pillow beside me. Alexander had slept here, anchoring himself to my side to physically guard my rest. But he had slipped away before dawn, respecting my boundaries and allowing me to wake up alone. The deep, grinding pain in my spine that usually greeted my mornings was completely absent, neutralized by the exceptional support of the ergonomic mattress and the sheer lack of physical labor. I pushed myself up into a seated position, running a hand through my tangled hair. The cream-colored cashmere sweater swallowed my frame, but it felt incredibly safe. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet sinking into the plush wool rug, and walked toward the adjoining private sitting room. The space was bathed in the bright, clear light of a winter morning. A heavy oak desk sat near the floor-to-soiling windows, overlooking the snow-dusted rooftops of Beacon Hill. But it was not the breathtaking view that brought my steps to an abrupt halt. It was the meticulous, organized array of items resting precisely on the polished mahogany surface. Alexander had not just provided me with a safe place to sleep. He had provided me with an entire arsenal of professional autonomy. Neatly arranged on the desk was a collection of top-tier, hospital-grade diagnostic equipment. There was a state-of-the-art digital sphygmomanometer, the exact model used in elite cardiac wards. Beside it rested a clinical-grade electronic fetal Doppler, complete with 3 unopened bottles of sterile ultrasound gel. Lined up in perfect symmetry were 6 distinct amber glass bottles containing high-end, pharmaceutical-grade prenatal vitamins, iron supplements, and concentrated folic acid. Finally, resting in the center of the arrangement, was an immaculate, custom-bound leather ledger with thick archival quality paper, accompanied by a heavy silver fountain pen. A profound, staggering wave of emotion crashed over me, tightening my throat and stinging my eyes. I stared at the digital numbers on the monitor box, the relief spreading through my chest like warmth seeping through gauze. Any other wealthy, powerful man in his position would have simply hired an expensive private physician to monitor me around the clock. He would have treated me like a fragile, helpless incubator, entirely dependent on external medical authority. But Alexander Ravellini was a man who observed, analyzed, and understood the fundamental core of the people he protected. He knew that my silver stethoscope was my absolute badge of honor. He knew that my professional competence as a pediatric triage nurse was the very foundation of my pride. By giving me these specific tools, he was silently declaring his total, uncompromising respect for my intellect and my medical capability. He was telling me that in this fortress I was not a captive. I was the chief medical officer of his legacy. I did not hesitate. I walked to the heavy oak desk and sat down in the leather chair, feeling an immediate grounding surge of professional focus. I rolled up the soft cashmere sleeve of my left arm, sliding the dark nylon cuff of the blood pressure monitor above my elbow. I secured the Velcro with a sharp, familiar tearing sound, pressing the blue activation button on the digital console. The machine whirred to life, the cuff inflating with a tight, mechanical squeeze that briefly cut off my circulation. I shut my eyes, attempting to regulate my breathing, but the chaotic emotional memories of the clinic confrontation and Carl Miller's violent threats suddenly flared up in my mind, causing a sharp, involuntary spike of adrenaline. The cuff slowly deflated, hissing quietly in the serene room. The digital screen flashed a harsh, warning red, 148/96. A resting heart rate of 110 beats per minute. Gestational hypertension. The physical toll of the extreme, hypervigilant terror I had endured for the past 24 hours was finally manifesting. Panic threatened to close my throat, but I brutally shoved it down. I was a seasoned pediatric triage nurse. I did not succumb to panic. I took a slow, calculated breath, leaning back against the leather chair and consciously unclenching the muscles in my jaw and shoulders. I reached for the amber glass bottles, identifying the precise, pregnancy-safe magnesium supplement required for cardiovascular regulation. I unscrewed the cap, dry swallowing a capsule with practiced efficiency. For the next 10 minutes, I engaged in tactical box breathing, staring blankly out at the falling snow, systematically forcing my nervous system to recalibrate. When my pulse felt steady against the pulse point of my wrist, I pressed the activation button again. The cuff squeezed. The machine hissed. The digital screen flashed a calm green. 120/80. A resting heart rate of 75 beats per minute. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving my body entirely. My medical intervention had worked flawlessly. I picked up the heavy silver pen, opening the pristine leather ledger. The thick paper smelled of rich parchment. I documented the date, the exact time, the initial hypertensive spike, the intervention administered, and the stabilized vital statistics in my precise, practiced clinical handwriting. The mechanical routine of medical charting was an anchor, a deeply familiar process that steadied my trembling hands. Next, I reached for the electronic fetal Doppler. I lifted the hem of my cashmere sweater, exposing the tight, rounded curve of my 6-month pregnant belly to the cool morning air. I uncapped a bottle of the sterile ultrasound gel, squeezing a generous, clear mound onto the center of my skin. The gel was freezing cold, making my abdominal muscles twitch in a sudden, involuntary reaction. I pressed the smooth plastic transducer firmly against the gel, clicking the power dial on the side of the device. A rush of static filled the quiet sitting room, followed immediately by a rapid, rhythmic, galloping sound echoing through the high-fidelity speaker. Swish, 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 swish. It was the strong, unmistakable heartbeat of my child. I stared at the digital readout on the Doppler's LCD screen, watching the numbers calibrate. 145 beats per minute. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated survival. It was the auditory proof that despite the grueling 12-hour shifts, the severe malnourishment, and the terrifying encounter with Carl Miller, the tiny life inside me was fiercely thriving. A perfect rhythm, a low, gravelly voice resonated from the doorway. I gasped, my hand jerking slightly on the transducer, sending a spike of static through the speaker. I had not heard him approach. Men like Alexander Ravellini did not make noise unless they explicitly intended to be heard. I looked up. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, his towering frame dominating the space. He wore dark, tailored trousers and a crisp white dress shirt. He had discarded his tie, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows, exposing thick, corded forearms dusted with dark hair and a matrix of faded silver scars. His steely gaze were locked entirely onto the small digital screen of the Doppler. A look of profound, consuming fascination etched across his stoic features. "You startled me," I breathed, my heart rate spiking slightly as I kept the transducer pressed against my stomach. "My apologies," he murmured, pushing off the doorframe and taking a slow, measured step into the sitting room. The unspoken tension between us instantly thickened, the air pressure shifting violently as he encroached on my personal space. "I did not want to interrupt your assessment." "What is the clinical verdict, Nurse Sterling?" The use of my professional title sent a warm, electric thrill straight down my spine. It was a subtle, deliberate validation of my identity. I adjusted the transducer, maximizing the volume of the galloping heartbeat. "The baseline fetal heart rate is 145 beats per minute," I reported, my voice steady, projecting the calm authority of a seasoned pediatric specialist. There are absolutely no signs of fetal distress. I successfully managed a brief maternal hypertensive spike, resulting from yesterday's security lockdown, bringing it back to optimal parameters through targeted supplementation and breathing regulation. His neurological and cardiovascular development is proceeding flawlessly. We are, against all logical medical odds, entirely healthy. Alexander absorbed my technical assessment with absolute silence. The deep respect shining in the dark depths of his eyes was intoxicating. He did not patronize me. He did not question my data. He did not chide me for the temporary blood pressure spike. He simply accepted my medical authority over the situation as absolute law. He closed the remaining distance between us, stopping just inches away from my chair. The scent of his cedar cologne mixed with the clinical smell of the ultrasound gel, creating a dizzying, highly atmospheric contrast between his violent world and my sterile profession. He looked down at my exposed stomach, watching the clear gel glisten in the morning sunlight. "May I?" he asked, speaking in a rough, gravelly whisper that vibrated deep in his chest. It was a request, not a command. The sovereign protector of the city, a man who forcibly seized territory and destroyed corporate careers with a single phone call, was asking for my explicit permission to touch his own child. The respect inherent in his hesitation shattered the last remaining fragments of my hyper-independent shield. I nodded slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. Yes. Alexander dropped to one knee on the thick rug. The sheer physical magnitude of his submission was staggering. He was a ruthless apex predator, a man who commanded an army of lethal ghosts, yet here he was, kneeling on the floor of his penthouse, completely captivated by the digital thumping of a tiny heart. He reached out with extreme agonizing care, placing his large, scarred hand flat against the gel-free side of my abdomen. The intense heat of his palm sank instantly into my skin. As if recognizing the heavy protective weight of its father, the baby delivered a sharp, distinct kick directly against the center of his hand. Alexander's breath caught audibly. His jaw clenched, the muscle near his ear ticking in rapid succession as a raw, unfiltered devotion washed over his usually impenetrable expression. His thumb traced a gentle, reverent arc over my skin, claiming the physical space with a quiet, terrifying intensity. The slow-burn romantic tension that had been suppressed beneath layers of fear and exhaustion finally ignited, wrapping around us in a tight, inescapable current. I looked down at the dark, powerful man kneeling before me, his hand resting securely over my child, and the agonizing truth finally settled into my bones. I had spent half a year running from his darkness, convinced that my medical competence and my stubborn pride were the only weapons I needed to survive. But as I listened to the steady, galloping heartbeat echoing through the absolute safety of his fortress, I realized I did not have to fight the world alone anymore. My professional competence was my indestructible armor, but Alexander Ravellini was the impenetrable fortress that would guard it forever. And for the very first time since the night my mother died, I was no longer merely surviving. I was finally, truly breathing. The profound, fragile silence that had enveloped the sunlit sitting room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, vibrating buzz of a secure, encrypted phone. Alexander did not flinch, but the warm, reverent father, who had just been kneeling before me, instantly vanished, replaced by the ruthless sovereign of the Boston underworld. He retrieved the dark device from his tailored trousers, his jaw locking into a rigid, unforgiving line as he read the incoming tactical transmission. "Dante has intercepted a hostile movement near the southern shipping port," Alexander stated, his words resonating with a low, gravelly vibration that left absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long, heavy shadow across the imported black granite floor. A faction loyal to Frank Moretti is attempting to exploit the chaos from yesterday's clinic lockdown. I must address this breach immediately. He closed the short distance between us, leaning down to press a firm, lingering kiss against the crown of my head. The intoxicating scent of expensive cedar and rain washed over me, a complete departure from the violent, bloody reality he was about to step into. "Do not leave this floor. The perimeter is entirely locked down. You are perfectly safe, Teresa. Come back in one piece," I whispered, the words escaping my lips before my stubborn pride could stop them. The sovereign's obsidian eyes flared with a dark, possessive heat. "Always." He turned and filtered out of the sitting room, the heavy double doors closing with a pressurized thud that sealed me safely inside the immaculate fortress. I sat alone in the quiet expanse of the penthouse, listening to the muffled, heavy thud of his combat boots fading down the long corridor. I took a slow, deep breath, returning my focus to the immaculate custom-bound leather ledger and the silver fountain pen resting on the mahogany desk. I was determined to maintain my professional equilibrium, to prove that I was an asset to this household, not a fragile liability waiting to shatter. My mind flickered briefly to Carl Miller and the red folder of my non-compliant medical records back at the downtown children's clinic. That life felt a million miles away now. Here, wrapped in the warmth of Alexander's charcoal topcoat, surrounded by hospital-grade diagnostic equipment he had meticulously provided, I felt an unfamiliar sense of absolute security. For exactly 42 minutes, the penthouse was a sanctuary of absolute, unbroken peace. Then, a sudden, frantic shout violently tore through the silence. "Hold him down. Get a medic up here right now." The voice was gruff, laced with sheer, unadulterated panic echoing wildly from the eastern guest wing. My heart hammered a frantic, bird-like rhythm against my sternum, but my pediatric nursing instincts completely overrode any lingering maternal hesitation. I did not freeze. I did not cower. I grabbed the heavy silver stethoscope from the desk, my fingers curling tightly around the cold metal tubing. I pushed myself up from the leather chair, ignoring the dull, throbbing ache in my swollen ankles, and moved swiftly out into the softly lit hallway. I navigated the labyrinth of the penthouse, my bare feet silent against the gleaming granite, until I reached the towering mahogany doors of the guest suite. I pushed them open, stepping directly into a scene of absolute terrifying chaos. The room was massive, draped in heavy velvet curtains and dark antique wood, but the sheer luxury was entirely overshadowed by the medical emergency unfolding on the king-sized bed. Enzo Ravellini, the traumatized 5-year-old nephew who had been brought in from the clinic yesterday, was convulsing violently. His small, fragile body was thrashing against the silk sheets, his dark eyes rolled back, his skin flushed a terrifying mottled shade of crimson. 2 massive tactical guards, men built exclusively for inflicting trauma rather than healing it, were hovering over the mattress in a state of helpless panic. One of the soldiers, a man whose eyes were literally the size of my thighs, was reaching out with heavy, calloused hands, attempting to physically pin the convulsing child down by his narrow shoulders. "Step away from him," I shouted, my voice slicing through the chaotic room with razor-sharp, absolute medical authority. The guards froze instantly, their combat instincts short-circuiting at the undeniable command in my tone. They turned to look at me, their eyes wide with confusion. I did not wait for their permission. I pushed past the towering soldiers, the oversized cream cashmere of my sweater brushing against their heavy Kevlar, tactical vests, and dropped to my knees beside the bed. "If you forcefully restrain a convulsing child, you will snap his ligaments and dislocate his joints," I ordered, my eyes darting to the heavy grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the room. It read 10:14 a.m. I needed to time the exact duration of the seizure. "Move that heavy oak nightstand away from the bed. Do it now." The guards complied immediately, the heavy furniture scraping loudly against the floor as they dragged it out of the strike zone. I leaned over the mattress, my hands moving with practiced, mechanical efficiency. I gently gripped Enzo's small shoulders, rolling him smoothly onto his left side. "He is experiencing a severe febrile convulsion," I explained aloud, keeping my voice incredibly steady to anchor the panicked men in the room. "It is caused by a rapid, extreme spike in his core body temperature, likely a secondary inflammatory response to the severe physical trauma he endured yesterday. The left lateral recumbent position ensures his airway remains completely clear of saliva, preventing lethal aspiration." I turned my head, locking eyes with a terrified senior housekeeper hovering helplessly in the doorway. "I need 2 large bowls of ice water and 6 clean washcloths. You have 30 seconds. Go." The housekeeper vanished down the hall, returning in exactly 25 seconds with the requested supplies. I plunged the washcloths into the freezing water, wringing them out with sharp, twisting motions. I stared at the excess water spreading across the silk sheets like blood seeping through gauze, a vivid, tactile reminder of the trauma I had witnessed in the alleyway 6 months ago. But this time, I was not running from the darkness. I was standing firmly inside it, armed with my intellect and my professional training. I applied the freezing compresses directly to Enzo's axillary, cervical, and inguinal regions, his armpits, the back of his neck, and his groin. We must cool the major vascular arteries rapidly. I narrated, my professional competence acting as an indestructible shield against the terrifying reality of treating the sovereign's bloodline. This lowers the systemic core temperature safely without inducing physiological shock. The mechanical hands of the clock shifted. At exactly 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the violent muscle spasms began to decelerate. A few seconds later, the boy's body went completely limp, entering the deep, unresponsive postictal state. I blocked out the room's visuals, tuning out the heavy, ragged breathing of the tactical guards standing behind me. I listened to the rapid, fluttering beats of his heart against the pads of my fingers. Tachycardic but steadily decelerating. His lungs were entirely clear. There were no crackles, no wheezing. The airway was perfectly unobstructed. "The seizure has passed," I murmured softly, my voice projecting a calm authority that finally allowed the crushing tension in the room to break. "He is entirely stable." Enzo's dark, heavily lashed eyes fluttered open. He was completely disoriented, his tiny chest heaving with deep exhaustion. He looked around the massive, intimidating room, his gaze landing on the towering, heavily armed soldiers standing near the walls. Pure, unadulterated terror flashed across his pale face. The child had not spoken a single word since the violent incident that had originally orphaned him. And he did not speak now, but his silent panic was deafening. I leaned in closer, deliberately blocking his line of sight to the lethal guards. The soft cream-colored cashmere of my sweater draped over him like a warm, protective blanket. "You are safe, Enzo," I whispered, gently brushing the damp dark hair away from his forehead. To ground him, I began to hum a traditional lullaby of the old country. It was an ancient melody, a song I had learned from the elderly immigrants in my South Boston neighborhood to comfort the terrified non-English, speaking toddlers at the free clinic. The soft, rhythmic syllables of the old dialect filled the silent room, pushing back the lingering shadows of fear. The traumatized boy stared at me for a long, agonizing second, his dark eyes wide with recognition at the ancestral tune. Then a tiny, trembling hand reached out. His small fingers curled fiercely into the soft fabric of my sweater. With a weak, shuddering sob, he pulled himself forward, burying his damp face directly into the crook of my neck. I wrapped my arms securely around his fragile frame, pulling him flush against my chest. My 6-month pregnant belly rested gently against the mattress, the life inside me completely still, as if holding its breath in absolute solidarity with the grieving child in my arms. I rocked him slowly, my chin resting on the crown of his dark hair, the ancient lullaby continuing in a steady, unbroken rhythm. I glanced up. The 2 lethal tactical guards were watching me in stunned, reverent silence. I had not used a weapon. I had not relied on brute force or intimidation. I had used my intellect, my precise medical training, and my maternal compassion to completely neutralize a crisis that had brought a highly trained security detail to its knees. For a long time, the only sounds in the suite were the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the child's softening breaths. I continued to monitor Enzo's pulse, keeping one hand gently pressed to his chest while the other maintained a soothing stroke down his spine. My mind methodically reviewed the triage protocols, calculating the exact dosage of pediatric ibuprofen he would need once he was fully coherent. I refused to let my guard down, operating on the pure adrenaline that had fueled my survival for the past 6 months. 20 minutes later, the heavy reinforced doors of the penthouse burst open with a violent, concussive crash. Alexander Ravellini moved through the immaculate foyer like a dark, apocalyptic storm. He had received a frantic, fragmented radio transmission from his detail reporting a critical medical failure involving his nephew. He had abandoned the tactical operation at the port, tearing through the icy streets of the city in his armored SUV with absolute, terrifying speed. He expected the worst. He expected to walk into a chaotic bloodbath, anticipating the agonizing necessity of calling in his corrupt underground medical team to perform a desperate resuscitation. He tore down the long, softly lit corridor, the heavy charcoal wool of his topcoat billowing behind him like the dark wings of a predatory bird. His combat boots hit the granite floor with heavy, lethal force. He reached the open doorway of the eastern guest suite and stopped dead in his tracks. The violent momentum carrying him forward evaporated instantly. The scene before him was not a chaotic medical disaster. It was a masterpiece of absolute, serene control. The 2 massive tactical guards were standing respectfully at attention in the far corners of the room, their suppressed weapons lowered, their posture completely, undeniably subservient to the pregnant woman sitting quietly on the edge of the king-size bed. I did not look up immediately when he entered. I was carefully wiping a cool, damp cloth across Enzo's flushed forehead. The boy was resting peacefully against my chest, his small fingers still tangled securely in the cashmere of my sweater. His breathing was deep, rhythmic, and perfectly steady. The terrifying fever had completely broken under my care. The traditional lullaby was still humming softly from my lips. I felt the sudden, massive shift in the room's air pressure before I saw him. I turned my head, meeting Alexander's striking irises. The silver stethoscope was draped proudly around my neck, resting against my collarbone. It was my badge of honor. It was the irrefutable proof that I was not a fragile liability to be hidden away in a gilded cage. The sovereign's broad chest heaved with a ragged, forceful breath. I watched the profound, earth-shattering realization wash over his stoic features. His fists, which had been clenched so tightly, his knuckles were white, slowly relaxed. The dark, consuming panic in his gaze dissolved, replaced by a raw, staggering awe. He realized, in that singular moment, that I had not merely survived the collision with his violent world. I had just commanded it. I had used my precise, intellectual authority to override his lethal soldiers and protect the most vulnerable remnant of his legacy. He stepped fully into the room, his presence instantly dominating the massive space. He did not look at his men. He simply raised his right hand and delivered a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. "Leave us," Alexander commanded, his command a deep, vibrating rumble that demanded absolute obedience. The tactical guards did not hesitate. They filed out of the suite in total silence, pulling the heavy mahogany doors shut behind them, sealing us inside a private, highly pressurized bubble of extreme romantic tension. Alexander walked slowly toward the bed. The scent of freezing rain and cold metal clung to his dark suit, contrasting sharply with the warm, clinical scent of the sterile compresses I had used. He stopped just inches away from my knees. The mattress dipped significantly as he sat down beside me, his massive frame radiating a heavy, intoxicating heat that made my pulse accelerate. Enzo stirred slightly at the movement. The boy opened his dark eyes, looking up at his uncle. Alexander reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing the hair away from the child's face. But Enzo did not let go of my sweater. He leaned into the sovereign's touch while keeping his tiny body firmly anchored to my warmth. "My detail reported a critical failure," Alexander said softly, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, uncompromising intensity. "They told me he was convulsing. They said they were completely powerless to stop it. By the time I breached the perimeter of this building, you had already neutralized the threat." "They are soldiers, Alexander," I replied, my voice steady, projecting the quiet confidence of a seasoned professional. "They are highly trained to inflict blunt force trauma and secure perimeters. They are not trained to manage pediatric febrile seizures." His core temperature spiked violently. I cooled his major vascular arteries, protected his airway, and timed the postictal recovery. "He is entirely stable now. He simply needs pediatric ibuprofen and uninterrupted rest." Alexander absorbed my clinical explanation in profound silence. He did not look at me as a vulnerable, pregnant woman who needed constant saving. He looked at me as an absolute equal, a partner, a queen who possessed the specialized knowledge required to fortify the very foundations of his empire. He reached out, bypassing the sleeping child entirely, and placed his large, scarred hand gently against my jaw. His long fingers curled around the nape of my neck, the rough texture of his calloused skin sending a violent electric jolt straight down my spine. The touch was fiercely possessive, yet unbelievably tender. "For 6 months," I whispered, the close proximity making my breath hitch in my throat. I stared into the depth of his stare, feeling the last, stubborn remnants of my hyper-independent armor cracking away under his gaze. Single motherhood was a relentless tide, and I was drowning one unwashed dish, one double shift at a time. I thought my competence was a curse that forced me to carry the entire world alone. I thought I had to be invisible to be safe. "Your competence is your greatest weapon," Alexander fiercely corrected me, his thumb tracing a slow, reverent arc across my cheekbone. The muscle near his ear ticked, betraying the immense, overwhelming emotion he was tightly suppressing. "I brought you into this fortress to shield you from the brutality of the world. But today, you proved that you do not just belong behind these walls. You command them. You sang the songs of my ancestors to my nephew. You took absolute control of my men. You saved his life with your bare hands and your brilliant mind." He leaned closer, eliminating the final fraction of space between us. The heavy, unspoken subtext of the past 24 hours crystallized into a singular, undeniable truth. "I am not asking you to love the criminal," Alexander murmured, his register descending into a dark, velvet whisper that vibrated directly against my lips. "I am asking if you can love the whole complicated mess of who I actually am, because I cannot exist without you. You are the absolute heart of this family." He didn't wait for my answer. He captured my lips in a deep, consuming kiss. It was not the frantic, desperate collision of our first night, nor was it a claim of mere physical possession. It was a profound, earth-shattering vow. It was the absolute sealing of a sovereign partnership, built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, raw intellectual recognition, and the absolute certainty that we were finally, permanently home. I let my eyelids flutter shut, melting into the crushing strength of his embrace. The chill of the winter storm raging outside the penthouse walls was completely eradicated by the blistering heat of his kiss. My hands reached up, my fingers tangling in the soft, thick hair at the nape of his neck, anchoring myself to the only man who had ever truly seen me. He tasted of whiskey and the cold winter rain, a wild, dangerous flavor that no longer incited fear, but rather an overwhelming, absolute devotion. His hand moved from my neck, sliding down my back to rest heavily against my swollen abdomen, his palm spreading a protective, grounding warmth over the life we had created together. At his touch, the baby shifted, a distinct, powerful kick pressing right against his calloused skin, a silent, irrefutable acknowledgement of his father's presence. Alexander broke the kiss with a ragged gasp, resting his forehead against mine, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven staccato breaths. The region's mafia kingpin was completely undone, anchored to the earth solely by the pregnant nurse who had once tried to disappear from him. We stayed exactly like that, as the mechanical clock continued to tick, and the snow began to fall against the reinforced glass windows, sealing the three of us in a world built on survival, intellectual equality, and a love that was absolutely invincible. The heavy, synchronized ticking of the grandfather clock in the Eastern guest suite was the only sound that remained after Alexander's devastating kiss. I slowly pulled back from the absolute, crushing warmth of his embrace, my hands lingering on the broad, muscular expanse of his chest. The violent adrenaline that had fueled my triage intervention with Enzo was finally receding, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep clarity. I looked down at the sleeping child resting peacefully on the silk sheets. His breathing was even, his core temperature perfectly stabilized by the pediatric ibuprofen and the cool, damp compresses I had carefully administered. The crisis was over, but in his illicit empire, I was quickly learning that the end of one crisis merely signaled the beginning of another. Alexander stepped back. The sudden loss of his immense body heat sent an immediate, involuntary somatic chill racing down my spine. The climate-controlled air of the Eastern guest suite rushed into the physical space between us, raising stark goosebumps along my bare arms as if a heavy, protective blanket had just been ripped away. His storm-gray eyes scanned my face with a terrifying, protective reverence. He did not ask if I was exhausted. He could see the physical toll written in the slight droop of my shoulders and the dark shadows beneath my eyes. But he also recognized the indestructible steel of my professional competence. He offered me his hand, his long, calloused fingers wrapped securely around mine, the rough texture of his skin sending a grounding, electric spark straight through my nervous system. "Enzo will sleep through the afternoon," Alexander murmured, his tone a deep, gravelly vibration that resonated comfortably in the quiet room. "My medical staff will monitor his post-ictal recovery. You have done more than enough, Teresa. Come with me." I allowed him to lead me out of the guest wing, the heavy mahogany doors closing silently behind us. We walked down the expansive, softly lit corridor of the penthouse. The air smelled faintly of fresh ozone rain and the rich cedar of his top coat. The cold, unyielding surface of the imported black granite floor under my bare feet sent sharp, grounding shockwaves up my legs with every step. It was a stark tactile reminder of exactly whose world I was walking into. The sheer scale of the Ravellini sanctuary was staggering. Hidden security cameras tracked our every movement from the shadowed corners of the molded ceilings. Massive pieces of bespoke Italian art hung on the walls, illuminated by motion sensor sconces that flared to life as we approached and dimmed as we passed. Every movement felt like a deliberate march away from the frightened, exhausted pediatric nurse I used to be, and toward the sovereign partner I was rapidly becoming. I could still feel the phantom weight of my silver stethoscope around my neck, a heavy anchor to the clinical world I had just left behind, yet my hand remained securely locked in the grip of a man who commanded an entire underworld army. We did not return to the sunlit sitting room or the master bedroom. Alexander guided me toward the northern wing of the fortress, stopping in front of a set of towering, reinforced steel double doors. This was his private study. It was the absolute nerve center of his empire, a room where underground ledgers were balanced, territories were ruthlessly divided, and lives were permanently altered with a single stroke of a pen. The doors hissed open, revealing a massive, immaculate space lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and dominated by a sprawling desk carved from a single slab of dark obsidian. The back wall was entirely composed of bulletproof glass, offering a sweeping, dizzying view of the Boston skyline currently being hammered by the relentless winter storm. I could hear the faint, muffled howl of the wind battering the glass, a chaotic symphony that contrasted violently with the absolute, heavily fortified silence inside. Standing at perfect attention beside the obsidian desk was Dante Russo. The silent tactician had not removed his heavy Kevlar vest. His dark suit was damp from the freezing rain outside, and his suppressed weapon remained holstered securely at his hip. Dante's expression was a masterpiece of mechanical, emotionless void, but the tension radiating from his rigid posture was unmistakable. In his gloved hands, he held a sleek, encrypted military-grade tablet, and a physical object that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. It was a thin, worn red folder. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact same folder Carl Miller had aggressively slammed onto the nursing station counter at the clinic just yesterday. The sharp, suffocating phantom scent of the manager's synthetic peppermint cologne seemed to instantly permeate the clean air of the study. A cold spike of dread pierced my chest. Alexander released my hand, moving smoothly behind the massive desk. The atmosphere in the room plummeted, the air pressure shifting violently as he transitioned from the tender protector into the lethal commander. Report, Dante. We successfully initiated the hostile corporate acquisition of your care center's parent company exactly as you ordered, sir. Dante began, his voice a chilling monotone that echoed precisely off the high ceilings. The board of directors completely folded under our financial leverage. However, during the digital integration of their internal servers, my cybersecurity division flagged an unauthorized, highly encrypted data pipeline originating from Carl Miller's personal administrative terminal. My professional mind snapped to attention, the lingering fatigue instantly burned away by a sudden sharp spike of analytical focus. Miller was a coward, a man built entirely on petty bureaucratic tyranny. When Alexander had violently shoved him into the filing cabinets and threatened his entire existence, standard psychological profiling dictated that the manager should have crawled into a hole and vanished. Instead, his desperate greed had apparently overridden his basic survival instinct. He attempted to sell her data, Alexander stated, his voice devoid of any inflection, a terrifying indicator of his absolute fury. Affirmative, Dante confirmed, stepping forward to place the red folder deliberately onto the smooth surface of the obsidian desk. Miller realized his corporate career was permanently terminated. In a desperate bid for financial compensation, he accessed the clinic's restricted digital archives. He compiled a comprehensive surveillance dossier on Miss Sterling. He exported time-stamped security footage of her arriving for her shifts, detailed logs of her physical exhaustion, and unauthorized scans of her preliminary employment health screenings. I stepped forward, my bare feet silent against the thick Persian rug, and reached for the folder. Alexander did not stop me. He watched me with a dark, calculating intensity, respecting my right to confront the violation of my own privacy. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped open the red cardboard cover. Inside was a horrifying compilation of my vulnerability. There were grainy, high-contrast printed photographs pulled from the clinic's lobby cameras. In them, I was standing near the triage desk, my shoulders hunched, my arms wrapped defensively across my oversized navy scrubs. The images were deliberately cropped and zoomed in on my midsection, highlighting the undeniable physical curve of my 6-month pregnancy. Beneath the photos were printouts of my erratic shift schedules, exposing the grueling double shifts I had picked up to cover my mounting prenatal vitamins and basic rent. Then came the notes regarding my repeated refusals to submit to the clinic's mandatory blood draws. He had even copied the internal logs detailing my occasional dizziness. weaponizing my own clinical triage charts against me. The absolute violation of my privacy was staggering. Miller had systematically cataloged my exhaustion, my financial desperation, and my physical limitations, transforming my survival into a neat, easily digestible package of corporate blackmail. He weaponized my medical records, I whispered, the sheer magnitude of the HIPAA violation making my stomach turn. I had spent half a year treating the poorest, most desperate children in the city, operating under the naive assumption that the medical facility was a neutral sanctuary. But the harsh, brutal reality was that for women without power, there were no sanctuaries. There were only predators waiting for the right price. Who was the buyer? Alexander demanded, his gaze locked onto the horrific photographs in my hands. The muscle near his jaw ticked in rapid, violent succession. A shell corporation directly tied to Frank Moretti's faction, Dante replied smoothly. Moretti's initial move at the southern port was a distraction, sir. Our field teams confirm. They have just begun mobilizing their primary tactical unit, now that they believe you are pinned down at the penthouse, following the earlier skirmish. Moretti intends to use the existence of your unborn heir as ultimate leverage. He plans to demand total operational control of the southern docks in exchange for Miss Sterling's perceived safety. Silence fell over the study, heavy and suffocating. The mechanical ticking of a luxury watch on Alexander's wrist sounded like a countdown to an inevitable detonation. Frank Moretti. The name was synonymous with desperation and unhinged violence in the city's underworld. He was a rival mobster who had been losing territory to the Ravellini Empire for years. Moretti had finally found a weapon he believed could bring the sovereign to his knees. The pregnant, exhausted pediatric nurse who had accidentally stepped into the crossfire. Alexander leaned forward, resting his large palms flat against the obsidian desk. His broad shoulders blocked out the stormy gray light filtering through the windows. He did not yell. He did not shatter the crystal whiskey decanter sitting on the side table. His reaction was a terrifying, absolute zero. Moretti believes my family is a commodity, Alexander said softly, the words slicing through the air with surgical, lethal precision. He believes he can put a price tag on the mother of my child. Moretti assumes she is a soft target, sir, Dante added, his dark eyes flickering briefly in my direction. He believes she is still living independently in the city, without a dedicated security detail. He does not realize that she has already been extracted and secured within the primary fortress. He is hunting a ghost. At the mention of my old apartment, my analytical mind caught a crucial discrepancy. I looked up from the violated medical files, my pediatric triage instincts kicking into high gear. I analyzed the data the same way I analyzed a complex patient chart. Miller doesn't have my actual address, I stated firmly, my voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room. Both men turned their attention entirely to me. When I was hired at the clinic, I immediately recognized that Carl Miller had predatory tendencies. He was constantly hovering over the female staff, monitoring our breaks, analyzing our vulnerabilities. I deliberately falsified my federal employment intake forms. I never listed my actual apartment location in the HR database. I provided a fake P.O. box address on the other side of the city and a secondary, untraceable burner phone number for my emergency contacts. I paid my utility bills in cash and took 2 different buses home every night, just to ensure no one from that clinic could ever follow me. The only thing Moretti just purchased for his blackmail scheme is a file full of dead ends. Alexander stared at me, the apocalyptic fury in his eyes momentarily stalling, replaced by a profound, staggering wave of raw admiration. The sovereign of the underworld, a man who employed an entire division of elite intelligence analysts and cybersecurity experts, was openly marveling at the sheer tactical brilliance of a broke, single mother trying to protect her unborn child. You actively falsified federal corporate documents to construct a blind perimeter around yourself. Alexander murmured, a dark, approving smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I protected my boundaries, I replied, lifting my chin, refusing to shrink under the weight of his gaze. I learned very early on that hyper-independence isn't just about paying your own bills. It's about ensuring that men who view you as leverage never get a map to your front door. Moretti can mobilize all the men he wants. They are going to kick down the door of an empty storage unit. Alexander's chest rumbled with a deep, vibrating sound of pure satisfaction. He turned his attention back to his tactician, the lethal commander completely restored. Moretti has made a fatal miscalculation. He believes he has cornered an exposed, helpless victim. Instead, he has simply handed me the perfect justification to eradicate his entire bloodline from this city. Dante nodded sharply, his posture rigid with anticipation. We have strike teams standing by on high alert. We can intercept this main mobilization at the port before they even realize the data is corrupted. Do not just intercept them, Dante, Alexander ordered, his voice dropping to a dark, velvet command that promised absolute devastation. I want the port locked down. I want Moretti's infrastructure systematically dismantled. And as for Carl Miller, I want him dragged out of his corporate office in broad daylight. I want every single rat in the Boston underworld to understand, with terrifying clarity, that speaking Teresa's name is an instantaneous, non-negotiable death sentence. It will be done, sir, Dante replied, turning on his heel. The tactician marched out of the study, the heavy steel doors sealing shut behind him, leaving Alexander and me entirely alone in the massive room. The air in the study felt highly pressurized, vibrating with the residual energy of the brutal commands that had just been issued. I stood perfectly still, the red folder clutched tightly against my chest. I stared at the man standing behind the obsidian desk. Yesterday, I would have looked at him and seen only a terrifying monster, a violent criminal whose very existence threatened the peaceful life I was desperately trying to build for my child. But today, standing in the center of his fortress, holding the physical proof of my own vulnerability, the paradigm had completely shifted. Alexander stepped around the massive desk, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate predator strides. He stopped just inches away from me, the immense heat of his large frame radiating through the soft cashmere of my sweater, instantly chasing away the lingering cold of the granite floor. He reached out, his calloused hands gently prying the violated red folder from my trembling fingers. He tossed the stolen medical records casually onto the desk, dismissing the threat entirely, and then cupped my face. His thumbs traced the delicate line of my jaw, his touch a shocking, electric contrast to the absolute violence he had just unleashed on the city. Are you all right, Teresa? The sheer tenderness of his question broke a dam inside my chest. I didn't cry. I had shed all my tears in the suffocating heat of the clinic over the past 6 months, sobbing silently into my pillow when the bills stacked up, and the baby kicked against my ribs in the dark. Instead, a profound, steadying wave of righteous anger washed over me, cementing my absolute loyalty to the man holding me. I spent half a year believing that if I just kept my head down, worked double shifts, and stayed entirely invisible, the world would eventually leave me alone. I confessed, my voice steady, vibrating with newfound strength. I thought my independence was a shield. I thought that if I asked for nothing, no one could ever take anything away from me. But the world doesn't leave vulnerable women alone, Alexander. It just waits for them to get tired. It waits for the right price. Carl Miller didn't care that I was an excellent pediatric nurse. He didn't care about the children I saved. He only cared that my pregnancy made me a profitable commodity for a monster like Moretti. You are not a commodity, Alexander fiercely corrected, his obsidian eyes burning with a raw, unfiltered devotion that stole the breath straight from my lungs. You are the absolute sovereign of this family. You are a woman who walked through hell and outsmarted every predator in her path. Moretti thinks you are my weakness. He is fundamentally, fatally wrong. You are the very reason I will leave no survivors tonight. You are the reason the city's criminal hierarchy is about to change. I looked up into his stormy eyes, the last remnants of my stubborn, fearful resistance crumbling into dust. I reached up, my hands resting flat against the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt. I could feel the heavy, steady thud of his heart, a constant, powerful rhythm that mirrored the galloping heartbeat of our child I had listened to on the Doppler just hours ago. I used to think your power was a cage, I whispered, my fingers curling into his shirt, anchoring myself to him. I thought your wealth and your violence would suffocate me. I thought accepting your protection meant surrendering my dignity. And now? Alexander asked softly, his large hand sliding down from my face to rest heavily, securely over my swollen abdomen. Now, I replied, leaning my forehead against the solid wall of his chest. Feeling a profound, earth-shattering sense of catharsis, I see it as a fortress. I see a man who will burn the world to ash before he lets a single spark touch us. Alexander let out a harsh, jagged breath, his arms wrapping entirely around me, pulling my pregnant body flush against his own. The baby kicked strongly against his palm, a tiny, defiant pulse of life, acknowledging the absolute safety of its father's embrace. "I swore an oath to you in that armored car," Alexander murmured, his lips pressing a burning kiss into the crown of my hair. "Tonight, I will honor it. I will cleanse this city of every threat, every shadow, and every corrupt coward who dared to view you as leverage. When the sun rises tomorrow, the debts will be gone. The enemies will be ash. The only thing you will ever have to focus on is your health, your brilliant medical mind, and the child we created." We stood together in the quiet sanctuary of the study, the brutal winter storm raging hopelessly against the impenetrable bulletproof glass. The agonizing war of my single motherhood, the grueling shifts, and the terrifying vulnerability of being a woman alone in a predatory world were officially, permanently over. I had stopped running from the darkness. Instead, I had simply allowed the most dangerous man in the darkness to build a wall of fire around me. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt absolutely, unequivocally safe. Alexander had left the penthouse over an hour ago, his heavy combat boots echoing down the granite corridor, as he marched out into the freezing Boston winter storm to eradicate the threats against our family. The silence he left behind in the northern wing of the fortress was profound, but I was not alone. Before following his sovereign out the door, Dante Russo had stepped briefly into the private study. The silent tactician had placed a heavy, military-grade, encrypted tablet onto the polished obsidian desk, his gloved fingers tapping a complex sequence of authorization codes onto the reinforced glass screen. "Mr. Ravellini requested that you have absolute, unimpeded visual confirmation," Dante had murmured, his expression a masterpiece of mechanical void, though a faint glimmer of profound respect softened his dark eyes. "He wants you to witness the exact moment your fear becomes permanently obsolete." Now, wrapped in the oversized, incredibly soft cream cashmere sweater Alexander had provided, I rested in the ergonomic leather executive chair and stared at the glowing screen. The tablet had established a secure, high-definition uplink directly into the hijacked closed-circuit security cameras of Le Petit Oiseau, one of the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive private dining clubs in the city's financial district. It was a place where politicians and corporate titans brokered deals over plates of imported truffles. Tonight, however, the dining room had been entirely cleared out. The scene on the screen was dripping with ostentatious, obscene wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden, cinematic glow over the imported mahogany tables and plush velvet seating. But the sprawling restaurant was entirely empty, save for one single table positioned deliberately in the dead center of the room. Frank Moretti lounged at the head of that table. The rival underworld boss was a coarse, brutally built man who wore his expensive tailored suit like a poorly fitted costume. He was casually swirling a glass of dark red vintage wine, his face twisted in a relaxed mask of arrogant, unearned confidence. He puffed slowly on an expensive Cuban cigar, entirely convinced that the stolen red medical folder resting on the table before him was the ultimate leverage that would bring the Ravellini empire to its knees. Carl Miller occupied the chair directly across from him. The visual contrast between the two men was pathetic and deeply disturbing. The corrupt clinic manager who had terrorized me for half a year was actively drowning in the deep end of a very dangerous pool. Even through the digital screen, my highly trained pediatric triage instincts automatically shifted into a state of clinical analysis. I could diagnose Miller's state of extreme sympathetic nervous system activation with flawless precision. His respirations were incredibly shallow and dangerously erratic, hovering around 30 breaths per minute, a textbook indicator of impending respiratory alkalosis. Severe diaphoresis coated his forehead in a slick sheen of cold sweat, reflecting the chandelier light. His fingers tapped a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm against the handle of his cheap synthetic leather briefcase. He was a bottom feeder who had accidentally swum into a tank of apex predators, and his physiological responses proved that his body recognized the lethal danger long before his arrogant brain did. The silence in the private dining room on the screen was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of stale corporate greed and impending ruin. Suddenly, the heavy brass-handled oak doors of the dining club swung open. Alexander did not make a dramatic, noisy entrance. He did not bring a shouting army of thugs to announce his presence. He simply walked into the room, bringing with him an absolute, paralyzing vacuum of sound. He moved with the slow, deliberate, devastating grace of an apex predator who already owned every square inch of the territory. His bespoke charcoal topcoat swept behind him, absorbing the ambient light. Following silently in his wake, Dante and a squad of ghost-like tactical operators fanned out, securing every exit, every window, and every blind spot with terrifying synchronized military precision. Alexander approached the center table. He did not wait for an invitation. He pulled out a high-backed velvet chair and took his place directly across from Moretti, placing his massive, scarred hands flat and relaxed upon the pristine white tablecloth. Moretti leaned forward, a greasy, triumphant smile spreading across his scarred face. The high-fidelity audio feed of the tablet picked up the subtle scrape of his chair and the wet sound of his breathing. Ravellini, Moretti sneered, blowing a thick cloud of cigar smoke across the table. I honestly didn't think you would actually show up without a battalion. But I guess when a man's secret legacy is suddenly on the line, he gets desperate. I have the pediatric nurse. I have the entire comprehensive medical file. Her exact address, her daily shift schedules, her physical vulnerabilities. You sign over the absolute operational control of the southern shipping docks tonight, or I send a heavily armed tactical team to her apartment before midnight. Alexander did not react. His face remained a masterpiece of stoic, beautiful cruelty. The muscle near his jaw ticked in rapid succession, the only physical manifestation of the apocalyptic, world-ending fury boiling violently beneath his skin. You are a fundamentally stupid man, Frank, Alexander said, his piercing silver gaze locking onto mine with absolute uncompromising authority. Wait, let me correct the flow naturally based on the scene. You are a fundamentally stupid man, Frank? Alexander's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that bypassed the tablet's speakers and vibrated directly through my chest. Moretti's arrogant smile faltered slightly, his thick fingers tightening around the stem of his wine glass. I have the ultimate leverage. I have the mother of your heir. You have a red cardboard folder full of completely useless dead ends. Alexander corrected him smoothly, his cadence cooling to an absolute, terrifying 0. You purchased a falsified postal address and a deactivated emergency burner phone number. You bought a ghost. A sharp wave of vindication washed over me as I watched the screen. When I had first accepted the grueling job at that specific dispensary, my survival instincts had driven me to falsify my permanent contact points on the employee intake forms. I had used a dead mailing drop on the other side of the city and a prepaid burner phone that I had tossed into the harbor months ago. It was a desperate, paranoid measure I had taken to ensure that my toxic past could never trace me through corporate HR records. Now, that single act of self-reliance had rendered Miller's stolen medical folder entirely obsolete. He had tried to sell my life to the underworld, but I had meticulously made sure there was absolutely nothing of substance in that file to sell. Teresa Sterling is not shivering in a drafty, unsecured apartment waiting for your pathetic thugs to kick her door in, Alexander continued, his voice lethal and absolute. She is residing in the absolute center of my impenetrable fortress, currently watching a live feed of you realizing that you have just forfeited your entire life. I watched the exact devastating microsecond the reality crashed down onto Moretti's face. His dark eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. His hand jerked violently, spasming against the crystal glass. The expensive goblet tipped over, shattering against the mahogany table. I stared at the wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood seeping through gauze. It was a visceral, tactile callback to the massive guard dog's blood in the freezing alleyway 6 months ago. But this time, the violence was entirely contained. It was being wielded surgically, explicitly to protect my peace. Alexander didn't even blink at the spilled liquid. He merely raised 2 fingers in a silent, lethal command. Dante stepped forward from the shadows, placing a secondary encrypted tablet on the table directly in front of Moretti. The screen illuminated, displaying a live aerial drone feed of the southern shipping docks. Suddenly, brilliant, silent flashes of orange light erupted across the digital display, as Moretti's primary illegal warehouses and hidden tactical vehicles were systematically, ruthlessly decimated by Ravellini strike teams in a coordinated explosive blitz. Moretti let out a primal, enraged roar, attempting to lunge across the table toward Alexander's throat. He never made it halfway. Dante and 2 massive operators subdued the rival boss in less than a fraction of a second, forcing him brutally face down into the spilled red wine. His arms wrenched painfully behind his back until his shoulder joints audibly popped. Alexander did not spare the neutralized mobster a second glance. His storm gray eyes shifted slowly, deliberately locking onto the pathetic, trembling figure of Carl Miller. The clinic manager was actively hyperventilating now. His heart rate had to be exceeding 160 beats per minute. He shrank back into his velvet chair, whimpering like a wounded animal, raising his trembling hands in a pathetic, useless gesture of surrender. "Please," Miller begged, tears streaming freely down his pale, sweaty face. "I didn't know who she really was. I swear to God, Mr. Ravellini, I was just trying to secure a financial severance. The corporate board fired me this morning. I had absolutely nothing left. You traded a pregnant woman's safety for a corporate severance package," Alexander stated, his words resonating with an absolute, terrifying zero. "You repeatedly threatened her with unpaid suspension. You tried to exploit her physical exhaustion to force her into taking illegal blood draws. You measure human life in 15-minute billing increments and profit margins, Mr. Miller. Therefore, we will speak in a language you fully comprehend." Alexander gestured sharply. A tactical operator stepped forward, slamming a thick stack of stapled legal documents directly in front of the manager. "Sign them," Alexander commanded. What is this?" Miller stammered, his eyes darting frantically across the complex legal jargon. "It is the total, irrevocable liquidation of your existence," Alexander replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "You are transferring your corporate pension, your private savings accounts, your luxury vehicle, and the deed to your condominium, to a charitable pediatric foundation of Teresa's exclusive choosing. You will sign away every single cent you have ever hoarded. If you hesitate for even 1 second, Dante will simply break your fingers, and my legal division will forge your signature after you are permanently disposed of." Miller sobbed openly, a pathetic, broken sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. With trembling, frantic hands, he clicked his cheap plastic pen and began signing the heavy documents, weeping hysterically as his entire life's work, his status, and his pathetic power were systematically erased with every stroke of ink. The poetic justice playing out on the screen was absolute, breathtaking, and entirely surgical. Alexander was not just executing the man who had tormented me. He was subjecting Miller to the exact same paralyzing, suffocating financial terror that the manager had inflicted on the vulnerable nursing staff at the clinic. He was leaving him utterly destitute, powerless, and stripped of all dignity. "Take Moretti to the harbor." Permanently, Alexander ordered his men, standing up from the table and buttoning his suit jacket with calm precision. "And as for Mr. Miller, strip him of his suit jacket and throw him out into the street. Let him see exactly how long he survives the freezing winter storm, without a corporate safety net to protect him." The live feed abruptly cut to a blank, silent black screen. I rested back heavily in the ergonomic leather chair, my chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. The crushing, hyper-vigilant terror that had governed my every waking moment for the past 6 months simply evaporated into the climate-controlled air of the study. The predatory men who had viewed my unborn child as leverage were completely gone. The manager who had used my crushing poverty as a weapon was utterly destroyed. My tablet screen was dark, but for the first time in my entire existence, my future was blindingly, beautifully clear. An hour later, the heavy grandfather clock in the main corridor chimed softly, marking the arrival of midnight. Outside the bulletproof glass of the study, the brutal New England winter storm continued to rage, whipping freezing rain and heavy snow against the city skyline in a chaotic, merciless frenzy. But inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of absolute, impenetrable warmth. The reinforced double doors of the study hissed open. Alexander stepped into the room. He brought the sharp, metallic scent of the freezing winter wind and the faint residual scent of burnt ozone with him. He casually shed his bespoke charcoal topcoat, tossing the heavy, expensive garment over a nearby leather armchair. He looked physically exhausted, the lines around his mouth tight with the toll of the evening's violence. But when his storm-gray eyes locked onto me, they ignited with a fierce, unwavering, protective fire. I stood up from the obsidian desk. I did not hesitate. I did not retreat behind the professional shield of my silver stethoscope. I walked quickly across the thick woven silk rug and wrapped my arms tightly around his solid waist, pressing my face directly into the crisp, cold white cotton of his dress shirt. Alexander let out a long, shuddering exhale, a sound of profound relief. His massive arms wrapped entirely around me, pulling my pregnant body flush against his radiating heat. The baby shifted immediately, delivering a soft, rolling kick against his abdomen, intuitively recognizing the absolute safety of its father's presence. "It is officially done," Alexander murmured, pressing his face into my hair, his lips brushing a warm, lingering kiss against my temple. "Moretti's infrastructure is nothing but ash and memories. Carl Miller is currently wandering the financial district, with nothing but a thin undershirt and a completely empty bank account. You will never ever hear their names again." I watched the feed. I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of raw awe and profound, staggering relief. "I saw exactly what you did for us, Alexander." He pulled back slightly, his large, calloused hands coming up to gently frame my face. His thumbs brushed across my cheekbones, wiping away a stray tear of overwhelming emotion that I hadn't even realized had fallen. "I did not just dismantle your immediate enemies, Teresa," he said softly, his gaze mapping my features with a dark, consuming devotion. "I secured your permanent foundation." He walked over to the heavy mahogany side table, where Dante had discreetly placed a secure, leather-bound briefcase earlier in the evening. Alexander clicked open the dual brass combination locks and extracted a thick, heavy manila folder. He brought it back to the obsidian desk, gesturing for me to take my place in the executive chair. I sat down, my heart hammering a sudden, nervous staccato rhythm against my ribs. He opened the folder, spreading the contents meticulously across the smooth black stone. The documents inside were printed on heavy, cream-colored archival paper, formally stamped with official, notarized federal banking seals. "What is this?" I asked, my clinical eyes scanning the complex legal jargon, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer volume of financial data presented before me. "Look closely at the second page," he instructed gently, tapping a long finger against the margin. I turned the heavy page. My breath caught violently in my throat, choking off the oxygen to my lungs. It was a certified, fully authenticated banking statement from the State Oncology Center. The massive, suffocating $43,250 debt that had haunted my every waking moment. The exorbitant medical bills from my late mother's agonizing, losing battle with cancer, was stamped with a massive, bold red seal. "Alexander," I choked out, my hands shaking so badly the heavy paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. You actually paid it." "I eradicated it," he corrected gently, dropping to one knee beside my chair, bringing his towering frame down to my eye level. "You spent 2 grueling years starving yourself, rationing groceries, and working exhausting double shifts to pay off a corrupt, broken healthcare system that ultimately failed your mother. That financial guillotine hanging over your neck is permanently dismantled. The state collections agency has been completely zeroed out. You owe them absolutely nothing." A tear spilled over my lashes, hot and fast, immediately followed by another. It was not the quiet collapse of defeat or fear. It was the overwhelming, earth-shattering release of a crushing burden I had carried entirely alone for far too long. For 6 months, single motherhood had been a relentless tide, and I had been drowning one unpaid medical bill, one unwashed uniform at a time. But as I looked at the notarized documents, I realized the toxic tide had permanently receded, leaving me standing on solid, unbreakable ground. "But that is not all," Alexander continued, his voice a low, steady rumble that anchored my spiraling, chaotic emotions. He reached over the desk and flipped to the next set of thick documents. These pages featured the embossed, intimidating crest of a massive, untouchable international Swiss banking conglomerate. "My world is inherently violent, Teresa. I have never lied to you about that reality," Alexander said, his storm gray eyes locking onto mine with absolute, uncompromising sincerity. "And I know that, despite everything I have done tonight, a part of your brilliant analytical mind will always harbor the hyper-vigilant fear that my enemies might one day breach our fortress walls. You need absolute, clean security for our child, something entirely separate from the shadow of the Ravellini Empire." I stared down at the document. It was the formal establishment of an irrevocable, multi-million-dollar generational trust fund. The sole beneficiary was listed as our unborn child, with Teresa Sterling listed as the primary, uncontested executive trustee with absolute withdrawal authority. "This trust is funded entirely by legitimate, fully taxed, impenetrable corporate assets," he explained, his thumb tracing a gentle, grounding arc over the back of my trembling hand. "It is legally and structurally insulated from any federal RICO investigations, future asset forfeitures, or underworld territorial disputes. No matter what happens to me, no matter what happens to my syndicate, you and our child will possess absolute, undeniable financial sovereignty." You will never have to answer to anyone. Not to a corrupt clinic manager, not to a predatory landlord, and most importantly, not even to me. I was completely, utterly paralyzed. The sheer magnitude of his protection was staggering. He hadn't just bought me expensive cashmere clothes, or moved me into a luxurious, heavily guarded penthouse. He had fundamentally restructured the financial reality of my entire universe to ensure my absolute autonomy. He was handing me the ultimate extreme safety fantasy, not by trapping me in a gilded, suffocating cage, but by handing me the unassailable keys to my own independent fortresses. He was giving me the power to leave him at any moment, knowing that it was the only way I would ever truly, freely choose to stay. I slipped out of the ergonomic leather chair and dropped to my knees on the thick woven silk rug right beside him. I didn't care about the sharp ache in my lower spine or the awkwardness of my swollen, 6-month pregnant belly. I threw my arms around his thick neck, burying my face deeply into the crook of his shoulder, and I finally truly broke down. I sobbed, my fingers tangling desperately in the dark, soft hair at the nape of his neck. Alexander didn't shush me. He didn't tell me to be strong or try to minimize my trauma. He wrapped his massive, powerful arms entirely around my trembling frame, pulling me fully onto his lap. He rocked me slowly, absorbing the years of bitter exhaustion, the acute trauma of the clinic, and the terror of the past 24 hours into his own chest. His large, calloused hand rubbed slow, rhythmic, soothing circles into my lower back, explicitly targeting the exact spot where the physical pain of my shifts used to be the worst. "I have got you," he whispered fiercely. His lips pressed warmly against my temple, his breath stirring my hair. "You can put the heavy armor down now, Teresa. You never have to be invisible again. I will carry the weight for you. I will carry it forever." The intoxicating smell of his cedar cologne, the rhythmic, heavy thud of his heart against my chest, and the solid, undeniable reality of his absolute protection surrounded me completely. The cold, decaying walls of my old triage post were officially a ghost of a past life. I was no longer a frightened, isolated nurse fighting a losing battle for survival in the shadows of the city. I was a sovereign partner, recognized for my intellect, deeply respected, and guarded fiercely by the most dangerous man in the world. We stayed on the floor of the private study for a long, beautiful time. The brutal winter storm howled helplessly against the thick bulletproof glass outside, a chaotic fury entirely incapable of breaching the absolute warmth, safety, and newly minted invincibility of our home. The tears eventually slowed, leaving behind a hollow, deeply cleansed exhaustion in my chest. I remained securely anchored against Alexander's broad shoulders, my fingers still tangled in the crisp white cotton of his dress shirt. The brutal, violent adrenaline that had kept my nervous system entirely wired for the past 24 hours was finally bleeding out onto the woven silk rug of the private study. For the first time since I had walked out of his penthouse 6 months ago, my mind was not racing with desperate, poverty-driven calculations. There were no more utility bills to fear, no corrupt managers to dodge, and no rival factions hunting the life growing inside me. I looked down at the massive obsidian desk one last time. The paid-in-full oncology medical bill and the multi-million-dollar generational trust fund documents sat illuminated under the amber glow of the desk lamp. They were physical proof that the war was over. I had won. Alexander Ravellini shifted his weight, his large hands moving from my back to gently grip my upper arms. He pulled back just enough to look at my face, his stormy gaze mapping my tear-streaked cheeks with a profound, quiet reverence. He did not offer any empty platitudes. He simply reached into his pocket, retrieved a pristine linen handkerchief, and meticulously wiped the dampness from my skin. The gesture was incredibly deliberate, a silent promise that the era of my solitary weeping was permanently over. "You have spent enough time in this study, dealing with the ghosts of yesterday," he murmured, his baritone a dark, gravelly vibration that resonated comfortably in the quiet room. He stood up with that signature, effortless predatory grace, towering over me for a brief second, before offering his calloused hand. "There is one more thing I need you to see, something that belongs entirely to tomorrow." I placed my trembling fingers into his palm. He pulled me up from the floor, immediately wrapping his arm around the heavy curve of my waist to support my swollen, aching joints. We left the imposing desk and the liquidated financial documents behind, walking back out into the softly lit granite corridor. The penthouse was immaculately silent, guarded by elite operators stationed far beyond the reinforced perimeter. I knew Dante Russo was out there in the dark, coordinating the final, ruthless erasure of Frank Moretti's remaining infrastructure, ensuring that no threat would ever breach these walls. Alexander guided me away from the Eastern guest suite, where his nephew Enzo was currently sleeping off his stabilized fever, turning instead toward a secluded, southern wing of the massive fortress. I had not explored this section of the residence yet. The air here smelled different. Lighter, completely devoid of the sharp ozone and dark cedar that characterized his tactical spaces. He stopped in front of a set of tall, ivory-painted double doors. He did not push them open immediately. Instead, he turned to face me, his hand resting securely against the side of my neck. When I realized you were carrying my legacy, I mobilized an independent architectural division. The head of the syndicate explained softly, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. They were granted unlimited resources and absolute clearance. While Dante was locking down your clinic and neutralizing your enemies, this space was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt to my exact specifications. It was finished an hour ago. He pushed the heavy doors open. I stepped over the threshold, my breath catching violently in my throat. The room before me was an absolute masterpiece of atmospheric warmth and staggering, uncompromising security. The walls were painted a soft, soothing shade of warm champagne, illuminated by recessed amber lighting that mimicked the gentle glow of a setting sun. In the center of the expansive space rested a breathtaking, custom-built crib, hand-carved from solid, unvarnished cherry wood. But it was not merely the ostentatious wealth that brought a fresh sting of tears to my eyes. It was the absolute, meticulous attention to my professional standards. My pediatric triage instincts immediately kicked in, analyzing the environment with a razor-sharp clinical focus. The mattress inside the crib was perfectly firm, completely devoid of any dangerous, suffocating plush materials, adhering strictly to the highest SIDS prevention protocols. Above the sleeping area, a silent, hospital-grade HEPA filtration system was seamlessly integrated into the molded ceiling, ensuring the ambient air was perpetually purified of any microscopic pathogens or environmental allergens. The massive windows overlooking the snowy city were doubly paned with ballistic glass, coated in a subtle UV-blocking film to protect a newborn's sensitive skin while maintaining an optimal, draft-free climate of precisely 72 degrees. To the left of the cherry wood crib sat a custom granite medical station. It was immaculately stocked with a set of high-end clinical tools, including a digital sphygmomanometer, an electronic fetal Doppler, and premium prenatal supplements. It was the exact diagnostic equipment I would have requisitioned for a high-risk VIP maternity ward, placed perfectly within my reach. It was not just a luxurious nursery. It was a sovereign, impenetrable medical sanctuary. I walked slowly across the hypoallergenic bamboo flooring, my hands reaching out to touch the smooth, polished edge of the cherry wood crib. The tactile sensation of the expensive, splinter-free grain grounded me. I stared down at the organic silk-fitted sheet, my chest heaving with a sudden, jagged breath. I had a plastic bassinet on layaway, I whispered, the confession tearing its way out of my throat before I could stop it. I kept my eyes fixed on the pristine mattress, unable to look at him as the sheer agonizing disparity of my two lives collided. It was $40 at a second-hand thrift store down the street from the clinic. It had a crack in the plastic base. I spent 3 weeks meticulously taping the fracture with industrial adhesive, praying it would be strong enough to hold his weight safely. I used to stand in my freezing apartment, staring at that broken plastic, terrified that my poverty was going to cost my child his life. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew impossibly heavy. Alexander closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He stepped directly behind me, wrapping his massive arms around my shoulders and pulling my back flush against the solid, radiating heat of his chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breath ghosting hot over my skin. "You will never look at a price tag again," he vowed, his voice vibrating with a dark, fierce territoriality that shook me to my core. His hands slid down my waist, coming to rest heavily and securely over the curve of my 6-month pregnancy. "You will never have to repair broken things to keep our family safe. I will strip this entire city down to its bedrock before I let you or this child want for a single basic necessity ever again." I leaned back into his embrace, allowing the sheer physical magnitude of his presence to absorb my lingering trauma. Our son shifted, pressing a distinct, powerful kick against the firm pressure of his father's calloused palm. Alexander's grip tightened marginally, a silent, profound acknowledgement of the life thriving between us. I stepped out of his arms just enough to turn around. I walked over to the granite medical station, my professional instincts offering a steadying rhythm to my overwhelmed heart. I picked up the electronic fetal Doppler and a tube of ultrasound gel. "I need you to hear something," I said quietly, lifting the hem of my shirt to expose the swell of my stomach. Alexander went perfectly still. He watched with a mixture of reverence and intense focus as I applied the cold gel to my skin and pressed the smooth probe against my abdomen. I adjusted the frequency, my fingers moving with practiced, flawless efficiency. A second later, the quiet champagne-colored room was filled with a rapid, powerful thumping sound. 145 beats per minute. Strong, healthy, invincible. Alexander dropped to his knees on the bamboo floor. The head of the most feared syndicate in the Northeast, a man who commanded legions of armed operatives and dictated the flow of power across the seaboard, bowed his head until his brow rested gently against my stomach. He closed his eyes, listening to the rapid, rhythmic heartbeat of his air broadcasting from the Doppler. He placed his large hands on my hips, anchoring himself to the sound of our survival. "I was so incredibly terrified of you," I admitted softly, running my fingers through his thick, dark hair. The quiet intimacy of the heavily fortified room made the brutal honesty feel entirely safe. "I thought your power was a cage that would eventually consume my independence. I thought you would view me as a liability." "You are the architect of my humanity, Teresa," he murmured, his lips pressing a burning, reverent kiss against my skin before he stood back up to face me. "I grew up in a world of shadows, raised by men who viewed family as leverage and absence as a virtue. I swore I would never bring a child into this violence. But you did not just bring a child into my world. You brought light into a fortress that had been dark for decades. You saved my nephew with your bare hands. You outsmarted the men who tried to sell you. You are not a liability. You are my equal." We stood together in the soft amber glow of the nursery, holding each other in a silence that was no longer built on fear, but on a profound, unshakable mutual respect. The ghosts of the clinic, the paralyzing medical debts, and the toxic shadow of Carl Miller were entirely eradicated. I had spent half a year running from the most dangerous man in Boston, only to discover that his absolute darkness was the only thing capable of keeping my world perfectly illuminated. 12 months later, the brutal New England winter had returned with a vengeance, burying the Boston skyline beneath a brilliant, blinding layer of pristine white snow. The freezing wind howled through the narrow city streets far below, but standing on the expansive private terrace of the Beacon Hill penthouse, the chaotic weather felt like a distant, muted painting. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp, icy air fill my lungs. The sharp cold stung my cheeks, standing in sharp opposition to the overwhelming, radiating warmth of the bundle currently resting against my chest. My 9-month-old son was wrapped securely in a thick thermal cashmere blanket, his tiny face tucked safely into the collar of my winter coat. He possessed his father's dark, impossibly thick hair, and the exact same overcast irises that could already command a room without a single word. But the stubborn curve of his chin and the quiet, observant way he studied the world were entirely mine. He was the perfect breathing synthesis of our two wildly different universes. I adjusted the blanket, my fingers brushing against the cold, familiar metal of the silver stethoscope draped loosely around my neck. I had not abandoned my profession. When Alexander had systematically liquidated Carl Miller's corporate assets and destroyed the corrupt management structure of the clinic, he had kept his promise. The funds had been entirely transferred into a newly established pediatric charity foundation. I was now the sovereign director of clinical operations. I no longer worked grueling 12-hour shifts on swollen feet, drowning in a tide of poverty and disrespect. Instead, I commanded a staff of 30 elite medical professionals, ensuring that no vulnerable mother in the city was ever forced to choose between her dignity and her child's health. I utilized my intellect and my medical authority every single day, completely supported by the insurmountable financial power of the Ravellini Empire. Behind me, the heavy glass doors of the terrace slid open. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The sudden absolute shift in the atmospheric pressure and the familiar, intoxicating scent of rich cedar and expensive tobacco announced his arrival. Alexander stepped out into the biting winter cold. He moved with the same deliberate, predatory grace that had once terrified me in a blood-soaked alleyway, but now that lethality was my ultimate comfort. He didn't speak immediately. He stepped up behind me, unfolding his heavy, dark charcoal topcoat and draping it meticulously across my shivering shoulders. The residual heat from his body was trapped in the thick wool fabric, enveloping my son and me in an instant, impenetrable cocoon of warmth. It was a perfect tactile echo of the night he had rescued me from the freezing rain, a gesture that never failed to make my heart race. Alexander wrapped his massive arms around my waist, pulling my back flush against his chest. He rested his chin on the crown of my head, his gaze sweeping over the glittering, snow-covered territory he controlled. "The temperature's dropping rapidly," he murmured, his low baritone vibrating pleasantly against my spine. "You should come inside." The architects finished the new fireplace in the eastern wing, and Enzo is currently attempting to dismantle a wooden train set in the living room. I smiled, leaning my weight entirely into his solid frame. The mention of his 6-year-old nephew brought a profound wave of warmth to my chest. Enzo was thriving. The traumatized, silent boy, who had clung to my sweater during a violent febrile seizure, was slowly healing, his laughter occasionally breaking the stoic silence of the fortress. We had built a found family from the ashes of unimaginable trauma, bound together not just by blood, but by a fierce, uncompromising loyalty. "I will come inside in a minute," I replied softly, reaching up to rest my hand over his where it lay protectively across our son's blanket. "I just wanted to look at the city. I wanted to remember." Alexander went perfectly still, his fingers intertwined with mine, his grip firm and steady. "Do you miss it, the invisibility?" "No," I answered immediately, the absolute truth ringing clear in the freezing air. I spent so long trying to be invisible because I thought it was the only way to survive. I thought if I carried the weight of the world entirely alone, no one could ever use it against me. But surviving isn't living, you taught me that. I looked out over the sprawling, icy metropolis. Down in the labyrinth of frozen streets, the rusted dumpster where I had stitched a guard dog's torn flesh remained hidden in the dark. Out in the shadows, the decaying pediatric clinic where I had nearly lost my sanity to medical debt and corporate tyranny stood vacant and powerless. Those places still existed, but they no longer held any power over me. The heavy black Ravellini card that I had once kept hidden in secret was now framed on the mahogany desk of my private office. The predators who had tried to turn my child into a commodity had been systematically erased from the earth. The debt that had threatened to crush my future was a forgotten nightmare. The scars on my heart and the calluses on my hands remained visible, permanent marks of the grueling war I had fought as a single mother. They would never completely fade, but they no longer defined me as a victim of circumstance. They were simply part of the intricate, necessary map that had ultimately led me here, to this towering balcony, to this specific, unbreakable life. Alexander turned me gently in his arms until I was facing him. The snowflakes were catching in his dark hair, melting against the sharp, beautiful angles of his jawline. He looked down at the sleeping infant nestled between us, a look of raw, unfiltered devotion softening his usually impenetrable obsidian eyes. Then his gaze lifted to mine, burning with the exact same intense, possessive fire that had claimed me 1 year ago. "The world outside this terrace will always be dangerous, Teresa," the sovereign whispered, his calloused thumb gently brushing a melted snowflake from my cheekbone. "But as long as I have breath in my lungs, the violence will never cross our threshold. You are the queen of this empire. You are the absolute center of my gravity." He lowered his head, capturing my lips in a deep, consuming kiss. The freezing winter wind completely vanished, overridden by the blistering heat of his mouth and the profound electric certainty of his vow. I kissed him back with everything I had, anchoring myself to the man who had torn down my walls of hyper-independence only to build a permanent, indestructible fortress in their place. We stayed on some snowy terrace for a long time, the three of us standing above the silenced city, a family forged in the shadows, healed by intellect and sustained by a love that was absolutely invincible.